Imagine a city not of dreams, but of smoke and steel, where fortunes were forged not just in factories but in the shadowy corners of speakeasies and back alleys. This is the story of Detroit in its most volatile and promising era, a crucible of industry and immigration where the American dream held a dark, mirrored twin, a world of immense power and brutal consequence. And at the very heart of this burgeoning underworld, a quiet, unassuming man named William Tocco began to weave a legacy that would outlast the roar of the assembly lines and shape the criminal landscape for generations. Before we delve into this intricate tapestry of power, ambition, and secrecy, I must offer a brief disclaimer. The narrative we are about to explore is a compilation of historical accounts, declassified law enforcement documents, and published testimonies. Our sole purpose is to present a coherent and factual timeline for educational and historical interest, to bring you the most accurate picture of these complex events. So, I urge you now, if you find these tales of the underworld as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these hidden histories and bringing them to you. Now, sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. Our tale begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, in a small, sun-drenched village in Sicily, a world away from the mechanized chaos of early 20th century America. The year is 1897, and a young boy named Guglielmo Tocco, who would later be known to the world as William, is about to embark on a journey that will irrevocably change his destiny and the fate of an entire city. He was born into a culture where family was everything, where loyalty was the highest currency, and where a deep-seated mistrust of external authority was bred into the bone. This cultural backdrop, the ancient code of omerta, a vow of silence and a refusal to cooperate with authorities, was as natural to him as the Sicilian air. It was this very code that he and his compatriots would transplant onto American soil, creating a resilient and impenetrable subculture that law enforcement would struggle for decades to dismantle. The decision to leave Sicily was driven by the same forces that propelled millions across the Atlantic, a desperate search for opportunity, for a piece of the prosperity that America promised. But for the Tocco family and others like them, this journey was also about escaping the grinding poverty and limited prospects of their homeland, carrying with them not just suitcases of meager belongings, but the intangible baggage of tradition, vendetta, and a particular understanding of how to achieve power and respect. When William arrived in America, he stepped into a Detroit that was a seething cauldron of potential. The automobile industry was in its infancy, but its growth was explosive, drawing a massive workforce from across America and Europe. This rapid, almost frantic expansion created a city of stark contrasts: immense wealth for the industrial barons and a daily struggle for the thousands of laborers who crowded into densely packed neighborhoods. It was in these ethnic enclaves, like the growing Italian community, that young William Tocco found his footing. He did not arrive as a kingpin, he was just another face in the crowd, another immigrant boy needing to find his way. The initial years were likely a grind, a period of assimilation and observation. He learned the language, not just English, but the nuanced language of the streets, who held power, where the vulnerabilities lay, and how a young man with ambition but no formal education could carve out his own piece of the city. The traditional paths of hard labor in the factories, while honorable, offered a limited ceiling. The underworld, however, presented a different kind of meritocracy, one where cunning, ruthlessness, and fierce loyalty could propel a person far beyond what any factory timecard could offer. His early forays into crime were probably small-scale, almost entrepreneurial in their nature. He would have been involved in the classic stepping stones of organized crime: protection rackets targeting small businesses within his own community, illegal gambling operations like bocce and card games, and loan sharking, providing much-needed cash at exorbitant interest rates to those who couldn't access traditional banks. These were not glamorous enterprises. They were brutal, pragmatic, and deeply exploitative. But they served a crucial purpose. They were his business school, teaching him cash flow management, the importance of enforcing contracts through fear, and, most importantly, the art of building a network. He was learning to identify talent, to spot the fiercely loyal enforcers, the shrewd accountants, the cunning diplomats who could negotiate disputes between rival factions. It was during this formative period that he began to forge the alliances that would become the bedrock of his empire. His most significant partnership was with a man named Tocco-Zerilli. Their bond, likely forged in childhood or early adolescence in Sicily, was more than just a business arrangement. It was a brotherhood, a partnership that would prove to be one of the most stable and successful in the entire history of the American Mafia. While other crime families were torn apart by internal betrayals and bloody power struggles, the Tocco-Zerilli alliance would endure for decades, providing the Detroit family with a remarkable and deadly stability. Together, they represented a perfect synergy of skills. Tocco, even in his youth, was developing a reputation for being calm, deliberate, and strategic. He was the thinker, the planner, the one who preferred to operate from the shadows. His influence felt rather than seen. He was building a persona of quiet authority, a man who didn't need to raise his voice because the threat of his power was always implicit. This was the calm before the storm, the patient construction of a foundation. William Tocco was laying brick by brick, connection by connection, a hidden infrastructure of power beneath the bustling, legitimate world of Detroit. He was not yet a boss, not yet a king, but he was a rising force, a young man patiently waiting for the catalyst that would transform the American underworld and provide him with the opportunity to leap from a neighborhood hustler to a criminal emperor. That catalyst was hurtling toward the nation, and it would arrive in the form of a constitutional amendment that would ban the very thing so many Americans craved: alcohol. Prohibition was coming, and William Tocco was ready to turn it into a goldmine. The dawn of Prohibition in 1920 did not create the American underworld, but it acted as a supercharger, injecting it with a level of capital, violence, and organizational sophistication previously unimaginable. For young, ambitious men like William Tocco and his partner Joseph Zerilli, the Volstead Act was not a restrictive law. It was a business license printed on a billion-dollar bill. Overnight, a massive, lucrative, and utterly illegal consumer market was born, and the gangs who had previously squabbled over neighborhood rackets were suddenly thrust into a high-stakes war for control of a city's thirst. Detroit, with its sprawling industrial waterfront and its proximity to Canada, became the absolute epicenter of this new bootlegging empire. The Detroit River was not just a body of water, it became a liquid highway for contraband, a dark, shimmering road to untold wealth. Tocco, with his strategic mind, understood the geography of opportunity better than most. He saw that controlling the riverfront was akin to controlling the spigot of a colossal financial wellspring. The partnerships he had so carefully nurtured in the previous years were now mobilized for this grand enterprise. The small-time enforcers who had shaken down shopkeepers became the commanders of fleets of fast, silent speedboats. The corner gamblers became managers of complex smuggling logistics, coordinating with Canadian suppliers like the powerful Bronfman family, who produced and stockpiled whiskey just across the border, waiting for the American dry spell to create its inevitable demand. This was the moment William Tocco ceased to be a neighborhood boss and began his transformation into a corporate executive of crime. The operations he helped orchestrate were breathtaking in their scale and efficiency. Boats would slip across the river under the cover of night or, with breathtaking audacity, sometimes in the foggy light of day, loaded with cases of Canadian whiskey and barrels of beer. They would land at secluded docks, warehouses, and even private residences along the Detroit shoreline, where teams of off-duty factory workers, paid handsomely for their silence and labor, would quickly transfer the cargo onto trucks. These trucks, often disguised as legitimate delivery vehicles, would then fan out across the city and beyond, supplying a vast network of speakeasies, blind pigs, and private clients that reached into every stratum of society, from the slums to the most affluent suburbs. The profits were astronomical, flowing into the organization's coffers like a river itself. But this immense wealth did not come without its perils. The bootlegging trade was a brutally competitive field, and the potential for violent conflict was ever present. Rival gangs, most notably the Irish Purple Gang, which initially served as enforcers and hijackers before becoming major players in their own right, constantly tested the boundaries. It was here that Tocco's philosophy of disciplined, low-profile violence, combined with strategic alliance, truly came to the fore. Unlike the flashy and publicly violent gangsters of Chicago, Tocco and Zerilli preferred a more surgical approach. Violence was not a first resort, it was a final, definitive one, used to send an unmistakable message rather than to create a public spectacle. A disappearance, a single, well-placed bullet, a business burning to the ground, these were the tools of their trade, executed with chilling efficiency. The message was clear: cross us, and you will be erased, not celebrated in the newspapers. This calculated approach extended to their dealings with the Purple Gang. Instead of engaging in a protracted, costly war that would attract unwanted attention from federal authorities, Tocco syndicate often chose to co-opt them, forming a working relationship that allocated territories and spheres of influence. This was a masterstroke of realpolitik, demonstrating that Tocco's greatest strength was not mere ruthlessness, but his strategic acumen. He understood that a peaceful, profitable monopoly was far superior to a chaotic and attention-grabbing war. This era also cemented the structure of what would become the Detroit Partnership. The bootlegging profits provided the capital to corrupt the very institutions meant to stop them. Police officers, politicians, prosecutors, and union officials were all placed on the payroll, creating a protective shield that allowed the organization to operate with a degree of impunity. The money was also laundered into a portfolio of legitimate businesses: laundries, restaurants, bakeries, and later, stakes in the casinos of Havana. These businesses served a dual purpose. They cleaned the vast sums of cash and provided a veneer of respectable citizenship for the men at the top. William Tocco was no longer just a gangster. He was becoming a businessman, a power broker, a man who understood that true, lasting power required a foothold in both the underworld and the upper world. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the Detroit organization led by Tocco-Zerilli was not weakened, it was institutionalized. They had built a financial and operational infrastructure that was far too robust to be dismantled by the return of legal alcohol. The end of the noble experiment simply meant they had to diversify their portfolio. They shifted their immense resources and refined their ruthless business model towards other ventures. They tightened their grip on labor racketeering, infiltrating powerful unions like the Teamsters, which gave them the power to paralyze the city's industries with a single phone call. They expanded their gambling empires, establishing sophisticated wire services for bookmaking and controlling illegal casinos, and they deepened their roots in loan sharking, now preying on businessmen and gamblers alike with the same cold efficiency they had applied to bootlegging. The repeal of Prohibition was not an ending, it was a graduation. William Tocco had navigated the most volatile period in American criminal history and emerged not just wealthier, but wiser, more powerful, and more deeply entrenched than ever before. He was now the quiet, undisputed architect of a criminal corporation, a man who had proven that the most effective empire is often the one you never see coming, built not on loud declarations of power, but on the silent, steady accumulation of influence, one boatload of whiskey, one corrupted official, and one strategic alliance at a time. With the repeal of Prohibition, the landscape of American organized crime underwent a seismic shift, but for the Detroit Partnership under William Tocco's guiding hand, it was merely a change in the weather, not the climate. The organizational genius that had been honed in the white-hot forge of bootlegging now found new, fertile ground in the sprawling, complex economy of a modern industrial city. The end of the alcohol ban did not leave a vacuum. It simply cleared the stage for a more diverse and insidious portfolio of criminal enterprises, each one more deeply entangled with a legitimate world than the last. Tocco, now a man in his late 30s, was in his prime, a leader whose reputation for quiet, ruthless efficiency had become his trademark. He was no longer the young hustler, he was a chairman of the board, a strategist who understood that the future of his organization lay not in the fleeting chaos of street-level crime, but in the systematic corruption of the very pillars of society. This was the era of consolidation and expansion, a period where the Tocco-Zerilli alliance solidified its control over Detroit's underworld with an iron grip sheathed in a velvet glove. The first and most lucrative of these new frontiers was labor racketeering. Detroit was the arsenal of democracy, a city running on the relentless rhythm of the assembly line, and the unions that represented the workers were becoming incredibly powerful. Tocco saw this not as a social movement, but as a business opportunity of unparalleled scale. His organization began a deliberate and calculated infiltration of key unions, most notably the Teamsters, the United Auto Workers, and various construction trade unions. The methods were a refined version of their bootlegging-era tactics, a blend of strategic violence, cunning diplomacy, and systemic corruption. Friendly or corruptible union officials were identified and placed on the payroll, their loyalty purchased with a steady stream of cash. Those who proved resistant were met with a stark choice, a persuasive offer they couldn't refuse, or a violent reminder of the consequences of refusal. The power this yielded was staggering. By controlling a union, the partnership could dictate the terms of business for entire industries. They could guarantee labor peace for a company that paid them off, or they could call a devastating strike against a company that refused to cooperate. They could siphon millions from union pension funds, treating the retirement savings of hard-working men and women as their personal treasury. They used their control over the trucking unions to monopolize the hauling industry, forcing businesses to use their overpriced services. This was no longer mere extortion. It was a form of corporate governance imposed through fear, a shadow tax on the entire economic engine of the city. Parallel to this, their gambling operations evolved from backroom dice games into a sophisticated, city-wide corporate structure. They established a wire service that provided up-to-the-minute betting lines on horse races and sporting events to a network of bookmakers across the region, each of whom paid a fee for the service. They ran floating craps games and illegal casinos that moved from location to location to avoid police raids, though often the raids were simply theatrics, prearranged with police on the take to maintain a public facade of law enforcement. The loan sharking business, or juice loans, also scaled up dramatically. With their massive capital reserves, they could offer large loans to businessmen, gamblers, and even other criminals at exorbitant interest rates, often points per week, a debt that could quickly become insurmountable. The enforcement of these debts was legendary and terrifying. A default was not met with a lawsuit, but with a brutal reminder of the consequences, ensuring a near-perfect repayment rate and a steady, massive flow of illicit profit. It was during this period of consolidation in the late 1930s that the national structure of the American Mafia, often referred to as La Cosa Nostra, was formally codified. The famous meeting in upstate New York in 1931, which reorganized the families and established a national commission, had its echoes in Detroit. The Tocco-Zerilli organization was formally recognized as a crime family, with a clear hierarchy and a seat at the national table. While the New York families grabbed the headlines with their flashy wars and public dramas, the Detroit family, under Tocco's philosophy, perfected the art of invisibility. They became known as one of the most disciplined, secretive, and profitable families in the country. Tocco himself was the embodiment of this low-profile approach. He avoided the limelight, shunned flashy displays of wealth, and conducted his business through layers of insulation. He was a family man, a respected figure in his community, a benefactor to local churches and charities. This carefully cultivated public persona was his greatest armor. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman, perhaps a little rough around the edges, but a far cry from the machine-gun-toting gangster of popular imagination. This duality was the core of his power. He could sit in a back room and order a murder with the same calm detachment he used to discuss an investment in a legitimate bakery. He understood that the most effective criminal is the one who is never seen as one, the man who wields power not from a throne, but from the shadows. By the end of the 1930s, William Black Bill Tocco was at the zenith of his power. He had successfully navigated the transition from the volatile Prohibition era to a new age of corporate-style crime, building an empire that was deeply interwoven with the city's economic and political fabric. His word was law in the Detroit underworld, his authority absolute. He had proven that a criminal dynasty could be built not on terror alone, but on a foundation of strategic brilliance, ruthless pragmatism, and an almost monastic commitment to secrecy. The foundation was now complete, and the empire was thriving in the darkness he had so carefully constructed for it, a silent, powerful force steering the destiny of a great American city from its underworld. The end of the 1930s and the dawn of the 1940s presented William Tocco with a new, complex challenge that would test the resilience and adaptability of his criminal empire, the Second World War. While the nation mobilized for a global conflict, channeling all its industrial might and human capital into the war effort, the Detroit Partnership saw not a patriotic duty, but a landscape brimming with fresh, illicit opportunity. The war, with its rationing, its massive government spending, and its singular focus on military production, created a black market of unprecedented scale and desperation, and Tocco's organization was perfectly positioned to exploit it. Detroit, as the arsenal of democracy, was the heart of this industrial frenzy, its factories working around the clock to produce tanks, planes, and jeeps for the Allied forces. This created immense pressure to meet production quotas, a pressure that Tocco and his associates turned into a weapon and a revenue stream. Their deep entrenchment in labor racketeering became more valuable than ever. They could guarantee no-strike agreements and a compliant workforce for war manufacturers, for a price, of course. Those who refused to pay this shadow tax on patriotism would find their production lines mysteriously hampered by slowdowns, wildcat strikes, or accidents that damaged critical machinery. The war effort, in essence, became a shield for their extortion, as few companies or government officials dared to risk a disruption in production by confronting the shadowy forces causing the trouble. Furthermore, the strict rationing of essential goods, tires, gasoline, sugar, meat, and nylon, created a golden age for the black market. The partnership used its existing logistics network, a ghost of its bootlegging glory, to traffic in these rationed commodities. They became the unseen suppliers for a populace chafing under wartime restrictions, selling stolen or counterfeit ration coupons, hijacking truckloads of scarce goods, and selling them at inflated prices to restaurants, businesses, and ordinary citizens desperate for a taste of normalcy. This was a profoundly cynical enterprise, profiting from the sacrifices of a nation at war, but it was also immensely profitable, funneling millions of new dollars into the family's coffers. It was during this period that the nickname Black Bill, by which Tocco would become infamously known, truly cemented itself in the underworld lexicon. The origins of the moniker are shrouded in the usual mythos, with some attributing it to his dark, Sicilian complexion and hair, while others, more ominously, claimed it reflected the black or deadly nature of his heart and his methods. Regardless of its origin, the name stuck, a label that conveyed a sense of ominous gravity and feared reputation, even as the man himself remained publicly in the shadows. This era also saw the further solidification of the family's corporate structure. The immense and diverse profits from labor racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and the wartime black market needed to be laundered and invested. Tocco, with his forward-thinking mindset, oversaw the expansion of their legitimate business holdings. They bought into more laundries, food distribution companies, and real estate, creating a complex web of interlocking enterprises that could commingle illicit cash with legitimate revenue, making the money untraceable and, more importantly, taxable, thus providing a veneer of legitimacy that was crucial for avoiding scrutiny from the IRS, which had proven to be a more formidable enemy than local police. The end of the war in 1945 did not slow the machine Tocco had built. If anything, the return of millions of soldiers and the transition to a peacetime economy created new tensions and new opportunities. The family's control over the unions became even more critical as the auto industry faced a wave of post-war labor strikes. Tocco-Zerilli positioned themselves as the ultimate power brokers, able to start or stop a strike based not on worker rights, but on their own financial interests. They also expanded their gambling operations, taking advantage of the post-war boom and the disposable income of a victorious nation. Wire services flourished, and the illegal casinos became more elaborate, often protected by a complex system of lookouts and corrupt police who would provide ample warning of any genuine raids. It was in this post-war environment of solidified power that the first significant threat to Tocco's reign emerged, not from a rival gang, but from the federal government. In 1949, the Kefauver Committee, a sprawling U.S. Senate investigation into organized crime, turned its spotlight on the national syndicate. For the first time, the American public was given a televised glimpse into the vast, hidden network of the Mafia. While the flashy New York bosses like Frank Costello became household names, the committee also took a keen interest in the quieter, but equally powerful, Detroit family. William Tocco was subpoenaed to testify. This was a moment of supreme danger. The entire ethos of his organization was built on secrecy and omerta. A public appearance before a Senate committee, televised to the nation, threatened to shatter that secrecy forever. When he took the stand, Tocco was the picture of the calm, respectable businessman he pretended to be. He was polite, soft-spoken, and invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on nearly every question posed to him. He refused to confirm or deny his association with known criminals. He denied any knowledge of a national crime syndicate, and he presented himself as a simple, legitimate real estate investor and family man. While this performance did not land him in jail, it was a watershed moment. His photograph was splashed across newspapers, his name was now publicly and inextricably linked to organized crime, and the shadowy empire he had spent 3 decades building was suddenly exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. The Kefauver hearings did not break the Detroit family, but they marked the beginning of the end of its perfect anonymity. The world now knew the name William "Black Bill" Tocco, and the federal government, having identified its target, would begin to slowly, methodically, and relentlessly close in. The exposure brought by the Kefauver Committee was a crack in the formidable armor of the Detroit Partnership, a faint but persistent glimmer of light into a world that had thrived in absolute darkness. For William Tocco, the decade of the 1950s became a protracted and increasingly difficult battle not against rival gangs, but against the relentless, bureaucratic pressure of the federal government, which had now identified him as a primary target. The days of operating with near impunity were fading into memory, replaced by a new era of surveillance, subpoenas, and the constant, gnawing fear of indictment. The family's response, orchestrated by Tocco's still-sharp strategic mind, was a further retreat into the shadows, a doubling down on their low-profile doctrine. Public flamboyance was forbidden. The flashy cars and ostentatious displays of wealth that characterized some of their New York counterparts were seen as suicidal in this new climate. The organization became more compartmentalized than ever, with layers of insulation carefully constructed between the top echelon, Tocco-Zerilli, and their inner circle, and the street-level operations. Business was conducted in more secure locations, often in the back offices of their legitimate fronts, with communication relying on trusted messengers and coded language, as the fear of electronic eavesdropping began to take root. This defensive posture, however, did not mean retreat. The criminal empire continued to operate with ruthless efficiency, its tentacles digging even deeper into the city's economic lifeblood. The revenue streams from gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering remained robust, but the methods of handling the money became more sophisticated. They began to funnel profits into newer, less conspicuous ventures, including vending machine companies, jukebox routes, and bars, all of which were perfect for laundering cash and extending their influence. It was also during this period that the family, following a national trend, expanded its interests to the emerging gambling paradise of Havana, Cuba, forming alliances with the Maya Landsky Syndicate and investing in casinos, thus diversifying their geographic risk. But the pressure was unceasing. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, who had long been reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a national crime syndicate, was now fully engaged in the fight. Federal agents began conducting prolonged surveillance on Tocco, logging his movements, photographing his associates, and meticulously building a mosaic of his daily life in the hope of finding a legal vulnerability. The primary weapon the government used was taxation. Following the model that had sent Al Capone to prison decades earlier, the IRS began a forensic examination of Tocco's financial affairs, scrutinizing every legitimate business, every real estate transaction, searching for discrepancies between his reported income and his observable lifestyle. This was a war of attrition, fought with audit trails and financial ledgers rather than Tommy guns, and it was a war for which the old-world gangster was psychologically and operationally ill-prepared. The first major legal blow fell not on Tocco directly, but on the structure of his organization. In 1959, a federal grand jury indicted him and 13 of his top lieutenants, including Joseph Zerilli, on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice. The allegation was that they had conspired to hide the assets of a convicted racketeer to prevent the government from seizing them. This was a classic racketeering charge, an attempt to attack the organization as a criminal enterprise. The trial was a media spectacle, a direct result of the exposure Kefauver had initiated a decade prior. Tocco, now in his early 60s, faced the courtroom with the same imperturbable calm he had always exhibited, but the strain was beginning to show. The evidence presented painted a detailed picture of a highly disciplined criminal corporation, with Tocco at its head. Despite their best efforts and a team of high-priced attorneys, the government's case proved compelling. The outcome was a devastating conviction for Tocco and several of his co-defendants. The sentence was a watershed moment. William Black Bill Tocco, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, the quiet architect of the Detroit Underworld, was ordered to report to a federal penitentiary. In 1960, he began serving his term, a profound humiliation and a symbolic end to his direct, day-to-day rule. The empire did not crumble in his absence. The succession plan that had always been implicit now became explicit. Leadership seamlessly passed to his lifelong partner, Joseph Zerilli, who maintained the same low-profile, disciplined approach. The family continued to operate, a testament to the corporate structure Tocco had so carefully built. It was no longer dependent on any single man, even its founder. But for Tocco himself, prison was a brutal and alienating experience. The man who had commanded the respect and fear of an entire city was now just a number, subject to the rigid, dehumanizing routines of institutional life. The cold, impersonal authority of the federal prison system was a world away from the power he had wielded, a stark reminder that the government ultimately held a force he could not intimidate, corrupt, or outmaneuver. His health, which had always been robust, began to decline within the confines of the penitentiary. The stress, the age, and the loss of control took their inevitable toll. He served his sentence, a model prisoner who caused no trouble, and was released, but the man who emerged was a shadow of the formidable figure who had entered. The conviction and imprisonment had broken not his spirit, perhaps, but his body and his ability to lead. He returned to a changed Detroit and a changed Underworld, his power now largely ceremonial, his legacy secure, but his active role in the empire he founded effectively over. The king had returned, but his throne was now occupied by another, and the world he had mastered was slowly, inexorably, moving on without him. The final chapter of William Tocco's life unfolded not as a dramatic downfall, but as a slow, quiet fading, a dimming of a once incandescent force of will and ambition. His release from federal prison marked not a triumphant return to power, but a reluctant transition into a state of semi-retirement, a forced withdrawal from the daily machinations of the empire he had built from the ground up. The criminal landscape of Detroit had subtly shifted in his absence. While the core structure of the partnership remained intact under Tocco-Zerilli's steady hand, new challenges were emerging. The racial dynamics of the city were changing, and with them, new, independent criminal elements began to carve out their own territories, less beholden to the old-world traditions and authority of the mafia. The federal scrutiny, once a temporary nuisance, was now a permanent and oppressive reality, with the FBI maintaining a constant, watchful presence on the remaining old guard leaders. Tocco, now an elder statesman of the underworld, returned to a life that was a pale imitation of his former existence. He maintained his residence, involved himself in what remained of his legitimate business interests, and undoubtedly offered counsel to Zerilli and the new generation of leaders, but the day-to-day command was no longer his. The respect for his name and his legacy within the insular world of La Cosa Nostra was undiminished. He was a founding father, a living legend whose past decisions still shape the present. But the visceral, immediate power that comes from issuing an order and knowing it will be unquestioningly executed was now a memory. This loss of active control, combined with the physical and psychological toll of his imprisonment, accelerated his decline. His health, which had begun to falter in prison, continued its slow deterioration. The robust constitution that had weathered the violent storms of Prohibition and the brutal business wars of the following decades was now succumbing to the inevitable march of time and the accumulated stress of a life lived in the crosshairs. He began to suffer from the ailments common to men of his age, but likely compounded by the years of constant pressure and his incarceration. The precise details of his final illness remain, like much of his life, shrouded in secrecy, but it is known that he was largely confined to his home in the later stages, a prisoner not of the state, but of his own failing body. The world outside continued to transform at a dizzying pace. The city he had helped shape through both shadow and light was beginning its painful descent into deindustrialization and urban decay. The auto industry was facing its first serious challenges from foreign competition, and the social fabric of Detroit was fraying, leading toward the civil unrest that would explode in 1967. The old neighborhood strongholds where Tocco had first built his power base were changing, and the insular Italian communities that had provided both a recruitment pool and a protective cultural barrier were beginning to disperse to the suburbs. The monolithic control the partnership had enjoyed was being eroded not by a single, catastrophic event, but by 1,000 small cuts of social change, increased law enforcement effectiveness, and the simple passage of time. It was in this context of a fading old world that William Black Bill Tocco passed away on March 20, 1972, not in a hail of bullets like so many of his contemporaries, but from natural causes, at his home in Grosse Pointe Park. He was 74 years old. His death was a symbolic end of an era. He had outlived many of his rivals, his enemies, and even some of his own protégés, a testament to his cunning and his disciplined approach to a violent trade. His funeral was a telling event, a mixture of genuine mourning and stark symbolism. It was attended by a who's who of the Detroit underworld, past and present, a final gathering of the tribe he had led for so long. They came to pay their respects to the man who had been their leader, their strategist, their benefactor. But conspicuously absent were the lavish, garish displays that sometimes characterized gangster funerals in New York or Chicago. In keeping with the Tocco doctrine, it was a subdued, if well-attended, affair. There were no floral arrangements in the shape of machine guns, no ostentatious processions. It was the funeral of a respected businessman, because that, in the end, was the identity he had worked so hard to cultivate. The man who had orchestrated murders, corrupted governments, and built a financial empire on a foundation of fear and exploitation, was laid to rest with an air of quiet dignity, the final and most perfect act of deception in a life defined by them. His obituary in the mainstream press noted his criminal convictions and his reputed status as a former crime boss, but for the general public, his passing was a footnote. For the underworld, however, it was the closing of a foundational chapter. The Detroit Partnership continued, and continues to this day in some form, but the era of its creation, the time of the immigrant founders who built something from nothing with sheer will and ruthlessness, was irrevocably over. William Tocco's legacy is a complex and paradoxical one. He was a man of violence who prized order, a corrupting influence who sought stability, a criminal who understood the mechanics of legitimate power better than most politicians. He demonstrated that the most enduring criminal enterprises are not those that scream for attention, but those that learn to whisper, that weave themselves so deeply into the economic and social fabric that they become almost indistinguishable from it. His story is not one of redemption, but of a particular kind of American success, a dark parallel to the immigrant narrative, proving that the ambition to build a legacy can manifest in ways both magnificent and terrible. The death of William Tocco did not, of course, erase the intricate and deeply rooted system he had helped engineer. Instead, it passed the enduring, though increasingly fragile, legacy of the Detroit Partnership into a new era, one that would test the resilience of his low-profile model against the full, unleashed force of modern federal law enforcement. The mantle of leadership, which had already been seamlessly transferred to Tocco-Zerilli during Tocco's imprisonment, remained firmly in place, but Zerilli himself was now an aging man, facing the same relentless pressure from the government that had hounded his partner. The 1970s and 1980s became a period of defensive warfare for the family, a stark contrast to the confident expansion of its foundational decades. The tools at the government's disposal were evolving from tax audits and conspiracy charges into something far more devastating: the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. Passed in 1970, this piece of legislation was a legal earthquake, designed specifically to dismantle criminal organizations by prosecuting their leaders for the patterns of criminal activity conducted by their subordinates. It allowed for extended prison sentences and the seizure of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise, attacking the very wealth and power that men like Tocco had spent a lifetime accumulating. For the Detroit family, which had always operated as a disciplined corporation, RICO was an existential threat. The first major RICO-based assault on the family's hierarchy began in the late 1970s, targeting Zerilli and his underboss, Anthony Giacalone, a notoriously ruthless figure who was famously suspected of involvement in the disappearance of Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa. The indictments were sprawling, detailing decades of criminal activity from illegal gambling and loan sharking to labor racketeering and murder. The trial was a monumental event, a direct confrontation between the modern American judicial system and the old-world secret society Tocco had helped build. The government's case was built on a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of a few low-level associates who, breaking the sacred code of omerta, decided to cooperate. While Zerilli's trial ended in a mistrial due to his failing health, the message was sent: the rules of the game had changed irrevocably. The age of absolute secrecy and invulnerability was over. The pressure continued to mount throughout the 1980s, a decade that would see the conviction of numerous high-ranking captains and soldiers under RICO statutes. The family's operations were forced to become even more decentralized and cautious. The immense profits from the traditional cash cows of gambling and loan sharking began to dwindle as law enforcement crackdowns made operations riskier. Their control over the labor unions, once an unshakable source of power and revenue, was also being systematically dismantled by federal oversight and internal reforms within the unions themselves. The world was becoming a much smaller, more transparent place for organized crime. The death of Joseph Zerilli in 1977, just 5 years after Tocco, marked the true end of the founding dynasty. Leadership passed to Jack Tocco, William's nephew, a clear indication of the family's desire to keep control within the inner circle, but he inherited a kingdom under siege. Jack Tocco proved to be a capable and shrewd leader in his own right, embodying the same low-key, business-like approach as his uncle, but he was fighting a rearguard action against a tide that could not be turned back. He himself would eventually be convicted under RICO in 1996, a poignant bookend to the legal troubles that had begun for the family with William Tocco's conviction decades earlier. The story of the Detroit family in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is one of gradual attenuation, not a dramatic collapse. They did not disappear. organized crime is a hydra, and it adapts. But the vast, citywide dominance enjoyed under William Tocco's reign was never to be replicated. The modern remnants of the organization are believed to be involved in more sophisticated, transnational crimes, including internet gambling, stock market manipulation, and fraud. But their power is a mere echo of what it once was. The cultural and social conditions that allowed the mafia to flourish, the tightly knit immigrant communities, the widespread political corruption, the limited economic opportunities for new arrivals, have largely vanished. The legend of William "Black Bill" Tocco, however, endures. He exists in the annals of American crime as the archetype of the quiet boss, the strategic mastermind who understood that true power lies in influence, not notoriety. His life offers a chilling lesson in organizational management and long-term strategic planning, albeit applied to a profoundly destructive purpose. He was not a folk hero, but a ruthless criminal, yet his story is inextricably linked with the history of Detroit itself, a shadowy thread woven into the city's industrial tapestry. From the gritty streets of his immigrant childhood to the quiet, respectable suburb where he died, his journey mirrors the broader narrative of 20th century America, a tale of ambition, assimilation, and the complex, often dark, pursuit of power. His legacy is a reminder that the most formidable forces are not always the loudest, that empires can be built in silence, and that the echoes of a whisper can sometimes outlast the memory of a scream. The story of William Tocco is the story of the foundation upon which a hidden version of a great American city was built, a foundation that, though cracked and weathered by time, still lies beneath the surface, a permanent part of its hidden history. To truly understand the monumental legacy of William Tocco, one must look beyond the individual crimes, the secret meetings, and the accumulated wealth, and instead examine the philosophical blueprint he implanted into the very DNA of the Detroit Partnership, an operational manifesto that became its greatest strength and, ultimately, a key reason for its prolonged survival even as other crime families crumbled into dust or were decimated by internal war and federal prosecution. The Tocco Doctrine, though never written down, was a living set of principles that governed every aspect of the organization's conduct, and its first and most sacred commandment was the cult of invisibility. Where other mob bosses, particularly in New York, seemed to revel in their infamy, seeing their names in the newspapers and their faces on television, Tocco viewed publicity as a pathogen, a deadly virus that attracted the attention of law enforcement, tax authorities, and ambitious rivals. He engineered a culture where success was measured by how little you were noticed, not how much you were feared. This meant no flashy cars, no garish jewelry, no high-profile nightclub appearances. His soldiers and captains were expected to blend into the fabric of the city as ordinary businessmen, tradesmen, and family men. This extended to their use of violence, which was never to be emotional or retaliatory in a public sense, but always clinical, strategic, and most importantly, quiet. A disappearance was far more effective than a public execution, as it created a lingering, unspoken fear rather than a sensational headline that would demand a police response. This discipline allowed the organization to operate for decades not as a glaring criminal tumor on the city, but as a hidden cancer, deeply embedded and metastasizing within the host body long before any symptoms became apparent to the outside world. The second pillar of the Tocco Doctrine was the supremacy of the partnership with Tocco-Zerilli. In the treacherous world of organized crime, where betrayal was often the quickest path to power, the unwavering alliance between these two men was an anomaly that became their greatest asset. While other families were torn apart by internal coups and bloody purges, the Detroit leadership presented a united, unbreakable front. This stability provided a predictable business environment for the entire criminal corporation. Capos knew who they reported to, soldiers understood the chain of command, and business partners, both legitimate and illicit, could rely on the consistency of their agreements. This stability fostered long-term planning and investment, both in illegal ventures and in legitimate fronts, creating a financial foundation that was remarkably resilient. The third principle was a forward-thinking embrace of corporate structure and financial sophistication. Tocco understood earlier than most that the future of large-scale crime was not in the cash-filled suitcase, but in the laundered bank account, not in the street-level shakedown, but in the systematic corruption of entire industries through labor racketeering. He oversaw the transformation of a street gang into a shadowy conglomerate, with diversified holdings and a clear organizational chart. This corporate mindset allowed them to weather the end of Prohibition not as a catastrophe, but as a strategic pivot, and it allowed them to manage the immense, complex cash flows from their gambling and loan sharking operations with an efficiency that rivaled legitimate corporations. The fourth and perhaps most nuanced aspect of his philosophy was his approach to power, which was fundamentally pragmatic rather than egotistical. He did not seek power for the adulation or the fear it inspired. He sought it for the control and security it provided. This pragmatism allowed him to form strategic alliances with unlikely partners, such as the predominantly Jewish Purple Gang, when it was economically and strategically beneficial. It meant that he was willing to cede certain territories or criminal activities to others if it meant avoiding a costly war that would draw unwanted attention. His goal was not to rule every corner of the underworld, but to rule his corner so absolutely and so profitably that no one would dare challenge him. This calculated, almost conservative approach to expansion stood in stark contrast to the imperial ambitions of other crime families, and it ensured that the Detroit partnership grew strong and deep roots, rather than spreading itself too thin. The enduring impact of this doctrine is seen in the very longevity of the Detroit crime family. While the five families of New York were convulsed by the Castellammarese War, the revelations of Joe Valachi, and the internal betrayals that led to the bloody reign of John Gotti, the Detroit family remained a model of stability. Even into the 21st century, law enforcement officials often remark on the family's continued adherence to its traditional, low-profile methods. The Tocco doctrine created a criminal entity that was built to endure, to outlast its founders, and to resist the sledgehammer blows of federal law enforcement not through direct confrontation, but through resilience, adaptability, and an almost preternatural patience. William Tocco's story, therefore, transcends the simple biography of a gangster. It is a case study in leadership and institutional building. He was a visionary who looked at the chaotic, violent world of early 20th century organized crime and saw the potential for order, for structure, for a legacy. He proved that a criminal enterprise could be built not on the unstable foundation of charismatic terror, but on the bedrock of disciplined strategy, financial acumen, and profound secrecy. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the same qualities that define a brilliant corporate CEO or a transformative political leader, strategic vision, organizational genius, and unwavering discipline, can be perverted to build an empire of corruption and violence. The city of Detroit moved on, the industries that provided his cover evolved, and the society that allowed his rise transformed, but the ghost of William Tocco's design, the silent, efficient, and ruthless machine he assembled, remains a permanent, if fading, part of the city's underworld, a chilling testament to the power of a whisper in a world that so often only listens for the scream. The sprawling, complex tapestry of William Tocco's life and legacy cannot be fully appreciated without examining the intricate web of personal relationships that surrounded him, a network of loyalty, blood, and calculated alliance that formed the human infrastructure of his power. At the very center of this web, beyond the formidable partnership with Joseph Zerilli, was his own family, the Toccos, who were not merely bystanders to his rise but active participants and beneficiaries in the vast criminal enterprise he commanded. His brothers, particularly Vito and Tony, were deeply enmeshed in the organization's operations, holding positions of trust and authority that ensured the family's interests were protected and its directives carried out with the unwavering loyalty that only kinship could guarantee. This nepotism was not a weakness but a strategic strength in a world where trust was the rarest and most valuable commodity. By placing his brothers in key roles, Tocco created a core of command that was virtually immune to betrayal from within, an inner sanctum bound by the unbreakable chains of blood and shared destiny. Beyond his immediate family, Tocco cultivated relationships with a diverse array of characters who populated the Detroit underworld, each man a specialist in his own dark trade. There were the enforcers, the men of violence whose names were whispered with dread, who carried out the necessary but grim tasks of coercion and elimination with cold proficiency, their actions ensuring that the boss's orders, no matter how severe, were not mere suggestions but immutable facts of life. Then there were the corruptors, the smooth-talking fixers whose currency was not violence but influence, men who moved through the corridors of City Hall and police precincts with envelopes of cash and promises of mutual benefit, greasing the wheels of government to ensure that the organization operated with a comfortable margin of impunity. And there were the accountants, the shrewd minds who mastered the art of moving and hiding money, who constructed the labyrinthine financial structures of shell companies and legitimate fronts that laundered millions in illicit profits and made the fortune of the Tocco organization virtually untouchable by conventional law enforcement. This diverse cabinet of talent was a testament to Tocco's ability to identify and utilize human capital, to recognize that a successful empire required not just soldiers, but diplomats, financiers, and administrators. His relationship with the wider Sicilian community in Detroit was also a critical component of his power base. He was not a distant, feared figure but a respected one, a man who had risen from their ranks to achieve immense power and wealth, and who, in return, acted as a patron and protector. He donated to church building funds, supported community festivals, and provided assistance to newly arrived immigrants, weaving a narrative of benevolent leadership that masked the brutal reality of his business. This community support served as a protective barrier, a wall of silence and sympathy that made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to find willing witnesses or cooperative informants within the neighborhood's tight-knit confines. Perhaps one of the most telling aspects of Tocco's personal world was his home life. He was, by all accounts, a devoted family man, a husband and father who maintained a seemingly normal, even mundane, domestic existence in his Grosse Pointe Park home. This duality was the cornerstone of his entire persona. The man who could calmly order a murder from a back room would return home to have dinner with his wife and children, inquiring about their day and offering paternal guidance. This ability to compartmentalize his life so completely, to wall off the monstrous aspects of his profession from the domestic sphere, is one of the most chilling and fascinating facets of his character. It speaks to a profound psychological discipline, a capacity to navigate two entirely separate realities without allowing the violence of one to corrupt the tranquility of the other. It also served a practical purpose. This image of the respectable family man provided the perfect camouflage, making it all but impossible for outsiders to believe that this quiet, unassuming gentleman was in fact the master of a criminal empire. His relationships with his children were likely complex and shrouded in the same secrecy that defined his public life. They would have grown up enjoying the privileges his wealth provided, attending good schools and living in a fine home, all while being shielded from the true source of their comfort. They would have been taught to respect their father, to obey the code of silence, and to present a unified, respectable face to the world. The psychological toll this double life must have taken on them is incalculable, living with the unspoken knowledge that their father's world was one of danger and dark secrets. In his later years, as the federal pressure mounted and his health began to fail, these personal relationships would have taken on a new significance. The loyalty of his brothers and his inner circle would have been his primary defense against the legal storms assailing him. The respect of the community would have been a source of personal solace, and the love of his family would have been his refuge from the crumbling empire he had built. In the end, the story of William Tocco is not just one of criminal ambition. It is a profoundly human story about the relationships that define us, the legacies we build for our families, and the intricate, often contradictory, roles we play in the lives of those around us. He was a brother, a partner, a boss, a patron, a husband, and a father, and it was within the complex interplay of these roles that the true man, in all his contradictions and complexities, can be found, a figure who reminds us that even the most powerful and feared individuals are, at their core, a sum of their relationships, bound by the same human needs for connection, loyalty, and legacy that define us all. As the final years of William Tocco's life unfolded in a quiet, suburban stillness, a world away from the violent dynamism of his youth, the full weight of his legacy began to settle not just upon the city he had secretly shaped, but upon the very nature of organized crime in America, serving as a complex blueprint and a cautionary tale for the generations that would follow in his formidable footsteps. His passing in 1972 did not create a power vacuum or plunge the Detroit partnership into chaos, a fact that stands as the ultimate testament to the success of his corporate model. The machine he built was designed to outlive its creator, and it did so with a stoic efficiency that would have made its founder proud. Yet, in the decades that followed, the landscape of illicit power continued to evolve in ways that both validated and challenged the Tocco doctrine. The rise of international drug trafficking in the 1970s and 1980s, for instance, presented a new, immense source of revenue, but also a far greater level of risk and federal scrutiny than the traditional rackets of gambling and loan sharking. Many crime families, lured by the astronomical profits, dove headlong into the narcotics trade, but the Detroit family, true to its conservative roots, largely abstained, recognizing that the penalties and the attention were antithetical to their core principle of longevity through low visibility. This decision, a direct reflection of Tocco's ingrained philosophy, likely spared them the devastating decimation that befell other families through drug-related RICO prosecutions. Meanwhile, the nature of law enforcement's assault continued to advance with terrifying efficacy. The Witness Protection Program, formalized in 1970, began to systematically dismantle the code of omerta that Tocco had relied upon, creating a pipeline of turncoats. Men like Jimmy Fratiano and later, Sammy the Bull Gravano, who traded their silence for a new life, providing federal prosecutors with the insider testimony needed to secure convictions against the highest echelons of power. The use of electronic surveillance became so sophisticated that the whispered conversations in social clubs and back offices, once the secure method of communication, were now captured on tape, providing juries with the chilling, unmediated voice of the mob itself. These technological and legal advancements meant that the shadows in which Tocco had so brilliantly operated were now illuminated by the piercing light of the federal government, making his model of secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain. The demographic and economic transformation of Detroit itself also eroded the family's traditional base of power. The white ethnic neighborhoods that had provided their soldiers, their buffers, and their cultural cohesion dispersed to the suburbs, while the city's industrial core, the very engine of their labor racketeering, hollowed out. The new criminal enterprises that emerged in the city were often more decentralized, more entrepreneurial, and less bound by the old world structures and codes, making them harder for the traditional mafia to control or absorb. The Detroit family, under the subsequent leadership of Jack Tocco, persisted, but as a diminished force, a relic of a bygone era trying to navigate a world that had fundamentally changed. The reflection on Tocco's life forces a broader contemplation on the archetype of the American gangster. He existed in a stark contrast to the flamboyant, media-savvy mobsters who would later capture the public's imagination. He was not a folk hero like John Dillinger, nor a charismatic celebrity like Al Capone, nor a tragic, Shakespearean figure like John Gotti. He was something else entirely, a quiet, patient, and brilliant institutionalist. His story lacks the dramatic, cinematic arc of a rise and fall. Instead, it is a story of a rise and a long, managed consolidation, followed by a gradual, institutional decline that began only after his direct influence had waned. He was, in many ways, the most successful kind of criminal, one who measured his success not in headlines or public notoriety, but in decades of uninterrupted profit and power, and in the enduring survival of the organization he founded. For the city of Detroit, his legacy is a permanent, if invisible, stain on its history, a reminder that its growth as an industrial titan was paralleled by the growth of a shadow government that siphoned its wealth, corrupted its institutions, and enforced its will with brutal violence. The factories may have closed, the population may have shifted, and the skyline may have changed, but the ghost of Tocco's empire lingers in the forgotten deals, the unsolved murders, and the hidden corridors of influence that were constructed during his reign. For students of history and crime, his life offers a masterclass in the mechanics of power, demonstrating that the most effective authority is often that which is never seen, never heard, and never openly challenged. In the end, William Black Bill Tocco achieved a form of immortality, not through the loud, messy legacy of a public figure, but through the silent, enduring influence of a system he designed. He proved that a criminal could be a visionary, that a thug could be a CEO, and that the most formidable empire is not the one that rules through fear alone, but the one that builds itself so deeply into the foundations of everyday life that it becomes indistinguishable from the world it inhabits. His story is a dark thread in the American tapestry, a narrative of ambition, intelligence, and moral compromise that continues to fascinate and horrify, a chilling reminder of the quiet men who, from the shadows, have the power to shape our world. To truly grasp the monumental, almost paradoxical, nature of William Tocco's influence, one must venture beyond the chronological timeline of his life and crimes and delve into the psychological and philosophical underpinnings of the empire he so meticulously constructed. An empire that stood as a stark counterpoint to the chaotic and flamboyant criminality that so often defines the popular imagination of the American Mafia. The very essence of Tocco's power lay in a profound understanding of a simple, yet often overlooked, truth, that the most potent form of control is not the one that is visibly enforced, but the one that is silently assumed, woven so seamlessly into the fabric of society that its mechanisms become nearly imperceptible. He was a master of what could be termed ambient power, a force that was felt in the absence of overt action, in the unspoken understanding that governed the backrooms of businesses, the negotiations of unions, and the decisions of public officials. This was not the power of the roaring lion, announcing its presence to all, but the power of the gravity, an inexorable, invisible force that dictated the motion of everything within its field without ever needing to reveal itself. This philosophical approach necessitated a specific type of personality, one that Tocco embodied completely, a preternatural calmness that bordered on the stoic, an almost total absence of public ego, and a limitless capacity for patience. Where other gangsters were driven by a need for respect that was loud and immediate, Tocco was driven by a vision of legacy that was quiet and long-term. He was playing a game of chess while many of his contemporaries were brawling in a street fight, thinking not in terms of individual moves, but of the entire endgame. This mindset allowed him to absorb short-term setbacks without panic, to forge alliances with former enemies when it was strategically prudent, and to avoid the kind of personal vendettas that so often led to the downfall of more emotionally volatile leaders. His famous moniker, Black Bill, while ostensibly referring to his complexion or his dark heart, can also be interpreted as a metaphor for this very quality. The man was an enigma, a dark space that absorbed light and gave nothing back, an entity whose true depth and nature were impossible to discern from the outside. This core philosophy directly shaped the operational tactics of the Detroit Partnership, creating a modus operandi that prioritized long-term gain over short-term glory. The systematic corruption of public officials, for instance, was not conducted through loud, clumsy bribes, but through a slow, patient cultivation of relationships, the offering of favors that created a web of unpayable debt, and the strategic placement of allies in positions of bureaucratic influence. This created a protective infrastructure that was organic and resilient, far more effective than the simple intimidation of law enforcement. Similarly, their approach to territorial control was not about waving a flag and making grand declarations, but about the quiet, methodical economic domination of a neighborhood or industry, making their presence so financially essential that any challenge to their authority would be seen as an economic threat, not just a criminal one. This is why their foray into labor racketeering was so devastatingly effective. They weren't just threatening individuals, they were inserting themselves as the indispensable middlemen in the relationship between capital and labor, a position that gave them leverage over the entire economic engine of the city. On a personal level, Tocco's ability to compartmentalize his life was not merely a convenient disguise. It was the psychological manifestation of his entire worldview. The loving family man in Grosse Pointe Park and the ruthless crime boss directing his empire were not two different people, but two complementary aspects of a single, unified strategy. The domestic sphere was his sanctuary, yes, but it was also his most important piece of legitimate camouflage, a living testament to his purported identity as a respectable businessman. This required a level of emotional and psychological discipline that is almost unimaginable, the ability to shut a door in his mind and completely separate the violence and treachery of his work from the tenderness and normalcy of his home. It is this profound duality that makes him such a compelling and terrifying figure. He was not a monster who reveled in his monstrosity, but a man who saw monstrosity as a necessary tool for achieving a very human desire for security, prosperity, and a lasting legacy for his family. In the final analysis, the story of William Tocco forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that the qualities we often admire in our leaders, vision, discipline, strategic brilliance, and an unwavering commitment to their people, can exist entirely independently of morality. He was, by any objective measure, a brilliant leader and organizational genius, but his genius was deployed in the service of a criminal enterprise that caused incalculable human suffering. His legacy, therefore, is a deeply ambiguous one, a testament to the fact that the human capacity for creating order and building enduring institutions is a neutral force, a powerful tool that can be used to construct hospitals and universities, or to build empires of corruption and fear. William Tocco chose the latter path, and in doing so, he became the quiet, patient architect of a shadow that, though faded, still lingers over the city of Detroit, a permanent reminder of the dark potential of human ambition when it is utterly unmoored from conscience. The sprawling narrative of William Tocco's life and the empire he built inevitably forces a comparison with the other titans of the American underworld, a comparison that starkly highlights the unique and potent efficacy of his low-profile philosophy and in doing so, helps to crystallize the very essence of his enduring legacy. When placed alongside a figure like Al Capone, the contrast is not merely one of style but of fundamental strategic understanding. Capone's Chicago was a theater of blood, a public spectacle of violence designed to terrorize and dominate through sheer, overwhelming force. He understood the power of the headline, the psychological impact of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and he cultivated a public persona that was as much a celebrity as it was a criminal. Tocco, operating in a city every bit as brutal and competitive, chose the inverse path. He understood that headlines were the precursor to handcuffs, that public notoriety was a poison that would inevitably attract the fatal attention of the federal government. Where Capone's empire was a brilliant but short-lived firework, exploding with spectacular light and sound before fizzling into darkness, Tocco's was a slow-burning fuse, carefully insulated, designed for decades of smoldering influence. The outcome of these divergent paths speaks for itself. Capone was imprisoned by his early 30s, his organization fractured and leaderless, while Tocco operated with impunity for over 3 decades and died an old man in his own bed. Similarly, a comparison with the modern-era gangster John Gotti, the Teflon Don, reveals the profound perils of abandoning the Tocco model. Gotti, with his expensive, flashy suits and his brazen public swagger, represented the ultimate rejection of the quiet, shadow-based power that Tocco embodied. Gotti craved the spotlight, believing his acquittals were a testament to his invincibility, but in reality, each public victory only tightened the focus of law enforcement and made his eventual, crushing conviction under RICO statutes an inevitability. Tocco would have viewed Gotti not as a successful boss, but as a reckless fool whose ego was a liability that doomed his entire organization. The New York Five families, for all their power and historical significance, were consistently convulsed by internal wars, betrayals, and the devastating testimony of turncoats, a direct result of the volatile, ambition-driven culture they fostered. The Detroit Partnership, under Tocco's foundational rule, was largely spared this internal carnage precisely because of the culture of discipline and patience he instilled. The stability of the Tocco-Zerilli alliance provided a model of consensual, shared power that prevented the kind of bloody succession wars that crippled other families. This comparative analysis extends beyond individual personalities to the very structures of their organizations. While the New York families were often collections of powerful, semi-autonomous crews whose captains could wield significant independent power, the Detroit family was run more like a tightly held corporation, with Tocco and Zerilli as the chairman and CEO, maintaining a firm, centralized control that prevented the rise of warlords who could challenge their authority. This top-down, disciplined structure was less glamorous but far more stable and, in the long run, more profitable and enduring. It is no coincidence that while the New York families became the subject of countless books, films, and television shows, the Detroit family remained a more obscure, though no less powerful, entity, precisely because they followed the Tocco playbook of avoiding the spotlight at all costs. This deliberate obscurity has, ironically, made the task of the historian more difficult, as the very secrecy that ensured their survival has also shrouded their full history in a fog that may never fully lift. Yet, this lack of sensationalism is the ultimate proof of Tocco's success. His legacy is not etched in the public consciousness through iconic photographs or famous quotes, but in the silent, continued existence of the organization he founded, an organization that learned too well the lessons of its founder. The modern remnants of the Detroit crime family, though a pale shadow of its former self in terms of power and reach, still allegedly operate, and they do so with the same quiet, businesslike demeanor that was the hallmark of William Tocco's reign. They have avoided the headlines that have dogged the East Coast families well into the 21st century. In this sense, Tocco's influence is not a relic of the past but a living, operational philosophy, a ghost in the machine of Detroit's underworld that continues to whisper the old commands. Be quiet, be patient, be disciplined, and above all, be invisible. The story of William Tocco, therefore, is not just the story of a man, but the story of an idea, the idea that in the underworld, as in nature, the most successful predators are not the loudest, but the ones who are the best camouflaged, the most patient, and the most strategically intelligent. He proved that in the economy of power, silence holds a value that no amount of notoriety can ever equal. Beyond the immediate sphere of criminal enterprise and the internal politics of La Cosa Nostra, the life and strategies of William Tocco offer a startling and unconventional lens through which to examine the very nature of the American dream itself, presenting a dark, parallel narrative of immigrant success that challenges the sanitized, mainstream version of hard work and moral fortitude leading to prosperity. Tocco's story is, in its own grim way, a quintessential American success story, one that follows the classic arc of the immigrant journey but veers sharply off the prescribed path of righteousness. He arrived on these shores with little more than the clothes on his back and the cultural baggage of his Sicilian heritage, facing the same prejudices, the same language barriers, and the same limited opportunities as millions of other newcomers. The traditional avenues of advancement, back-breaking labor in the factories for meager wages, promised a life of quiet desperation, a slow and grinding ascent into the lower rungs of the middle class. But Tocco, like many ambitious immigrants before and since, possessed a fierce drive to not just survive, but to conquer, to build something of his own, to secure a legacy that would lift his family name from obscurity to prominence. He looked at the American landscape and saw its true, unvarnished mechanics, that power and wealth were the ultimate arbiters of success and respect, and that the system, for all its professed morality, was inherently malleable, ripe for exploitation by those with the courage and the cunning to see its weaknesses. In this, he was the ultimate American capitalist, albeit a brutal and illicit one. He identified market demands, for illegal alcohol, for gambling, for unregulated loans, and he built a corporate apparatus to meet those demands with ruthless efficiency. He understood supply chains, logistics, risk management, and the critical importance of controlling market share, often through coercive monopolies. He practiced a form of vertical integration, controlling the production or importation of his goods, the transportation, the distribution, and the retail endpoints, whether they were speakeasies or bookmaking operations. He reinvested his profits, diversifying his holdings into both illegal and legal ventures, creating a conglomerate that was resilient to market shifts. He even mastered public relations, cultivating an image of a respectable businessman and community benefactor to maintain his social license to operate. In every aspect, except for the legality and morality of his methods, William Tocco was a model of entrepreneurial success, a self-made man who built an empire from nothing. This dark reflection of the American dream forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that the same ambition, innovation, and drive that we celebrate in industrial titans like Henry Ford and Andrew Carnegie can, when channeled through a different moral compass, produce a figure like Tocco. The line between the ruthless capitalist and the organized crime boss can be disturbingly thin. Both are willing to crush competition, exploit labor, and bend the rules of society to their will in the single-minded pursuit of wealth and power. Tocco simply operated in a space where the rules were more starkly defined and the enforcement more violent, but the underlying impulse was eerily similar. His life stands as a permanent rebuttal to the myth of moral inevitability in success, proving that in the raw, unregulated marketplace of human ambition, the winners are not always the most virtuous, but often the most ruthless, the most strategic, and the most willing to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. His legacy, therefore, is not confined to the history of organized crime. It is a commentary on the very soul of America, a reminder that the promise of this nation, that anyone, from anywhere, can achieve anything, is a double-edged sword, capable of inspiring both profound good and profound evil. William Tocco grasped that promise with both hands and forged from it a kingdom of shadows, proving that the American dream has a dark, resilient, and terrifyingly efficient underbelly. The immense and sprawling narrative of William Tocco's criminal dominion, while a testament to his personal cunning and strategic foresight, was ultimately made possible by the specific and fertile ecosystem of early to mid-20th century Detroit, a city whose very industrial DNA created the perfect conditions for his shadow empire to not only take root but to flourish with such profound and insidious success. Detroit was more than just a backdrop. It was an active participant and an unwitting accomplice in the rise of the partnership, its unique characteristics providing the essential nutrients, the capital, the corruption, the chaos, and the cover, that allowed Tocco's vision to become a self-sustaining reality. The primary engine of this symbiotic relationship was, without question, the city's industrial might, concentrated in the automotive industry. The assembly lines of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler did not just produce cars. They produced something far more valuable to a criminal enterprise: massive, concentrated flows of cash. The weekly paychecks of hundreds of thousands of workers created a vast ocean of disposable income, a ready-made customer base for the partnership's gambling dens, numbers rackets, and loan sharking operations. A factory worker who had just received his pay on a Friday afternoon was a prime target for a friendly dice game or a bet on the horses. And if he lost too much, the same organization was ready to offer him a juice loan to cover his debts, ensnaring him in a cycle of usury from which few could escape. This constant, cyclical flow of cash from the factories through the workers' hands and into the pockets of Tocco's organization was the financial lifeblood of the empire, a reliable revenue stream that dwarfed what would have been possible in a less economically vibrant city. Furthermore, the industry itself became a target through labor racketeering. The auto industry's reliance on complex, just-in-time supply chains and its vulnerability to work stoppages made it exquisitely susceptible to extortion. By infiltrating and controlling key unions, particularly the Teamsters who controlled the vital trucking routes, Tocco gained the power to paralyze the entire industry with a single phone call. This was not a vague threat. It was a lever of control over the heart of the American economy, and the industrial barons, for whom production quotas and stock prices were the ultimate gods, were often willing to pay millions in bribes and kickbacks to ensure labor peace. The very thing that made Detroit great, its centralized, powerful industrial base, also made it uniquely vulnerable to this form of systemic criminal infection. The city's geography was another gift to Tocco's ambitions. The Detroit River, a bustling maritime highway for legitimate commerce, was effortlessly transformed into a smuggler's paradise during Prohibition. Its narrow width made the quick, clandestine trip from Canadian distilleries to American speakeasies a simple matter, while its busy traffic provided perfect camouflage for the bootleggers' fast boats. This ready-made logistics network gave the Detroit gangs a significant advantage over their landlocked rivals in other cities, allowing them to dominate the Midwestern liquor trade and amass the foundational capital that would bankroll their future diversification. This physical landscape of opportunity was matched by a political and social landscape that was equally malleable. Detroit was a young, rapidly growing city, a melting pot of competing ethnic groups where political machines were still in their formative stages and where corruption was not an anomaly but a widely accepted cost of doing business. The police department and city hall were notoriously permeable institutions, their officials often underpaid and overstretched, making them easy targets for the partnership's corrupting influence. A well-placed bribe could ensure that a gambling raid was telegraphed hours in advance, that a key witness would develop a sudden case of amnesia, or that a lucrative city contract would be steered to a business front controlled by the organization. This systemic corruption acted as a protective shield, allowing Tocco's operations to run with an efficiency that would have been impossible in a more rigorously policed environment. Finally, the city's dense, tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods, particularly the Italian enclaves of the East Side, provided a ready-made recruitment pool and a cultural fortress. Within these communities, the Code of Omerta was a deeply ingrained cultural value, and distrust of external authority, especially the police, was the default position. This created a wall of silence that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to gather intelligence or secure cooperation, allowing the organization to operate in plain sight, hidden in the open. Detroit, in its era of peak industrial power, was therefore the perfect host for the parasite that Tocco and his associates represented. It provided the money, the means, the vulnerability, and the cover. The city's incredible energy, its chaotic growth, and its single-minded focus on industrial production created blind spots and weaknesses that a man of Tocco's intelligence was uniquely equipped to exploit. He did not create the corruption of Detroit. He found it, refined it, and weaponized it, building his empire not in spite of the city's nature, but because of it. In the end, the story of William Tocco is inextricably linked with the story of Detroit itself. Two entities that grew powerful and complex together, one in the blazing light of industry, the other in the deep and enduring shadows it cast. As the decades have rolled on and the physical Detroit that William Tocco knew has transformed beyond recognition, the philosophical and historical echoes of his reign have proven to be remarkably resilient, seeping into the cultural consciousness and continuing to inform our understanding of power, secrecy, and the very nature of organized crime in the modern era. The Tocco model, with its emphasis on institutional longevity over individual notoriety, has become a subject of quiet study, not just by law enforcement agencies seeking to understand the enduring threat of traditional organized crime, but also by historians and sociologists analyzing the hidden architectures of power in urban America. His life story serves as a critical case study in the immense strategic advantage of patience in a world that increasingly valorizes speed and visibility. In an age of social media and relentless self-promotion, the image of William Tocco, a man who wielded immense power for decades while leaving behind so few photographs, no recorded interviews, and a minimal public footprint, seems almost alien, a relic from a different civilization. Yet, this very anachronism is what makes his example so potent. He demonstrated that in any contest between the loud and the quiet, the visible and the hidden, the latter possesses a profound strategic depth that the former can never match. This lesson has not been lost on the modern iterations of the criminal underworld, which have evolved into more decentralized, network-based enterprises, often leveraging technology to achieve a level of anonymity that would have impressed even Tocco. The digital dark web, cryptocurrency transactions, and encrypted communications are the modern equivalents of the backroom social clubs and coded language of his era, all serving the same ultimate purpose: to create operational security through obscurity. While the methods are new, the underlying principle is pure Tocco. The most secure power is the power that cannot be seen. Furthermore, his legacy forces a continual re-evaluation of the mafia's role in the American narrative. For many years, the popular depiction of organized crime, heavily influenced by the operatic violence and flamboyant characters of New York, framed it as a kind of dark, parallel society, a world of glamorous danger and tragic figures. The story of William Tocco and the Detroit partnership shatters this romanticized image, replacing it with something far more mundane and, because of that, far more terrifying. The image of organized crime as a business, a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient corporation that happened to deal in illicit goods and services. This desanitized view is crucial because it aligns the criminal underworld with the mechanisms of the legitimate world, revealing it not as an alien entity, but as a malignant outgrowth of the same capitalist drives that fuel the stock market and corporate boardrooms. Tocco was not a romantic rebel. He was a predatory businessman, and understanding him as such is essential to understanding the true, banally evil nature of the threat he represented. On a more local level, in Detroit itself, the ghost of Tocco's empire lingers in the city's collective memory and in its physical landscape. While the specific storefronts and social clubs are long gone, the patterns of corruption he helped institutionalize left a lasting mark on the city's political culture, creating a cynicism and a weariness with authority that persisted for generations. The sheer scale of his hidden influence serves as a permanent reminder of how easily a democracy's institutions can be hollowed out from within when faced with a patient, well-funded, and utterly immoral adversary. For the few remaining old-timers in the city's neighborhoods, the name Tocco might still be spoken in a hushed tone, a whispered artifact from a time when the city had a different kind of king. For law enforcement, the Detroit family remains a benchmark, a reminder that the most dangerous criminal organizations are not necessarily the ones making the most noise, and that the fight against them is a war of attrition, requiring the same level of patience and long-term strategy that the criminals themselves employ. The story of William Tocco, therefore, does not conclude with his death or even with the gradual diminishment of his organization. It continues as a living lesson, a dark strand of historical DNA that continues to shape our understanding of power, crime, and the American city. He built his empire not on sand, but on the bedrock of human nature, on ambition, greed, fear, and the universal desire for respect and security. And as long as those forces exist, the lessons of his life and his methods will remain terrifyingly relevant, a chilling testament to what can be achieved when a brilliant mind dedicates itself entirely to the art of building in the shadows. The enduring fascination with the life and empire of William Tocco inevitably leads us to a profound and unsettling contemplation of the nature of legacy itself, forcing us to question what truly remains of a man when the power he wielded has faded, the wealth he accumulated has been dispersed, and the organization he built has been forced into the shadows of a new century. For most of his adult life, Tocco's legacy was a living, breathing entity. The Detroit Partnership, a dynamic criminal corporation that responded to his will and served as the ultimate manifestation of his ambition and strategic genius. But as the years passed and the world changed, that tangible legacy inevitably transformed, becoming something more spectral, more abstract, yet in some ways even more powerful. The physical empire, with its specific rackets and its corrupt alliances, could be and was dismantled piece by the relentless force of federal law enforcement. But the philosophical legacy, the Tocco doctrine of silence, patience, and corporate discipline, proved to be far more resilient, a viral idea that has infected our understanding of power long after the man himself was gone. This is the paradox of William Tocco. The very methods he used to ensure his own and his organization's obscurity have, in the end, guaranteed his immortality in the annals of American crime. By being the quietest of the Godfathers, he became one of the most instructive. His life is now a textbook for criminologists, a case study for historians, and a cautionary tale for those in power about the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions. His story is told not to glorify him, but to dissect the mechanics of his success, to understand how a man can hide in plain sight while pulling the strings of an entire city for generations. This posthumous fame, born of analytical interest rather than public notoriety, is perhaps the legacy he would have most appreciated, a final, perfect act of achieving influence through studied silence. On a more personal level, the legacy he left for his own family is a complex and fraught inheritance, a mixture of material comfort and the heavy burden of a notorious name. His children and grandchildren were provided with financial security, educated in good schools, and given opportunities he could only have dreamed of as a young immigrant boy. Yet, they also inherited the unspoken weight of their name, the knowledge that their prosperity was rooted in violence and exploitation, and the lifelong shadow of their patriarch's dark reputation. They were forced to navigate a world that might whisper their name with a mixture of fear and curiosity, to carry the genetic code of a man who was both a devoted father and a ruthless crime lord. This is the human cost of such a legacy, a price paid not by the founder, but by the generations that follow, who must reconcile the loving family man they knew with the monstrous public figure history remembers. For the city of Detroit, Tocco's legacy is etched into its history as a permanent stain, a reminder of a time when the city's incredible industrial might was shadowed by an equally powerful criminal underworld. His story is an indelible part of the city's folklore, a dark chapter that speaks to its gritty, complex, and often contradictory soul. The modern revitalization of Detroit, with its focus on technology and a new, diverse economy, exists in stark contrast to the smoke-filled, industry-driven city Tocco ruled. But the echoes of his era can still be felt in the city's enduring struggles with corruption, in the memories of its older residents, and in the physical decay of neighborhoods that once thrived under the shadow of his protection and exploitation. His legacy, for Detroit, is a permanent memento mori, a reminder of the city's past vulnerabilities and the constant need for vigilance against the corrupting influence of unchecked power. And finally, for us, the audience looking back through the lens of history, the legacy of William Tocco is a mirror held up to our own fascination with power and morality. We are drawn to his story not because we condone his actions, but because he represents an extreme embodiment of traits we are conditioned to admire: ambition, intelligence, loyalty, and strategic brilliance, while being utterly devoid of the morality that normally constrains them. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that evil is not always a snarling, obvious monster. Sometimes, it is a quiet, calm, and impeccably dressed man sipping coffee in his kitchen, a man who loves his children and builds an empire on a foundation of human suffering. His legacy, therefore, is not just a historical account, it is a philosophical challenge. It asks us where the line is between a visionary leader and a predatory criminal, between a shrewd businessman and a ruthless exploiter, between building a legacy and building a tomb. William Tocco spent his life building an empire in the shadows, and in death, he has left behind not a simple story of a gangster, but a lasting, ambiguous, and deeply unsettling question about the true price of power and the nature of the legacies we all strive to create. To truly compartmentalize the monumental narrative of William Tocco's life and its impact, one must inevitably confront the stark and often overlooked human cost of his meticulously constructed empire, the vast and silent ocean of suffering that lay beneath the calm surface of his corporate-style criminality. For every strategic triumph, for every $1 million laundered through a legitimate front, for every politician quietly placed on the payroll, there existed a corresponding wave of devastation inflicted upon the countless anonymous lives caught in the gears of his machine. This was not the dramatic, cinematic violence of gangland shootouts, though those certainly occurred, but the slow, grinding, everyday violence of economic predation and psychological terror that was the true engine of his wealth. Consider the legions of small business owners, the shopkeepers and restaurateurs, who were forced to pay a monthly tribute for protection, a fee that offered safety not from external threats, but from the organization itself. This was not a business transaction. It was a tax levied by a shadow government, an extra overhead that could mean the difference between survival and bankruptcy for a family struggling to achieve their own small version of the American dream. The pressure was relentless, the collectors impersonal and menacing, and the refusal to pay was not an option. It was an invitation to a brick through the window, a fire in the storage room, or a brutal, bone-breaking lesson delivered in a back alley. These entrepreneurs, the very backbone of a healthy community, lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear, their ambition and hard work systematically siphoned to fuel an empire they dared not name. Then there were the victims of the partnership's loan-sharking operations, the juice loans that offered a temporary lifeline at a usurious cost. These were often desperate people, gamblers in over their heads, businessmen facing a temporary cash flow crisis, workers with a sick child and mounting medical bills. The initial handshake and the quick cash felt like a salvation, but it was a trap. The weekly vig, the interest payment, was designed to be so high that it became nearly impossible to pay down the principal. The debt would balloon, becoming a crushing weight, a financial prison from which there was no escape. The enforcement was legendary in its cruelty. Missed payments were met not with polite reminders, but with threats, public humiliation, and savage violence. Men were beaten in front of their families, their homes vandalized, their livelihoods destroyed. The psychological torment was as devastating as the physical harm, creating a population of broken individuals living in terror of a knock on the door, their lives and the security of their families held hostage to an ever-mounting, impossible debt. Beyond the direct economic victims, there was the broader corrosion of the social and political fabric of Detroit itself. The systematic corruption of police officers, city officials, and union leaders, a cornerstone of Tocco's operational strategy, created a culture of cynicism and impunity that eroded public trust for generations. When a citizen could no longer believe that the police were there to protect them, or that a politician was serving the public interest, the very contract of civil society began to fray. This corruption created a two-tiered system of justice, one for the connected and powerful, and another for the ordinary citizen. It meant that crimes went uninvestigated, that evidence disappeared, that witnesses developed convenient amnesia, all to protect the interests of the partnership. This perversion of justice created a profound sense of helplessness and alienation among the city's populace, a sense that the system was rigged, that the powerful were untouchable, and that the ideals of fairness and equal protection under the law were a hollow joke. And we must not forget the most final of costs, the lives extinguished. While Tocco himself likely never pulled a trigger in his later years, his orders, or the implicit understanding of his will, led to murders, disappearances, and executions. These were not just rival gangsters, they were potential witnesses, business partners who knew too much, insiders who showed a hint of disloyalty, or simply men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each was someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. Their lives ended not for a passionate reason, but for a cold, calculated, business-related one. Their stories were buried along with them, their voices silenced forever to protect the empire's secrets. This is the true, grim balance sheet of William Tocco's legacy. The sophisticated corporate structure, the strategic alliances, the patient accumulation of power, all of it was built upon this foundation of human misery. For every dollar that was laundered through a seemingly respectable business, there was a trail of tears, of fear, of broken dreams, and of shattered lives. The quiet, calm narrative of his rise obscures this cacophony of silent suffering. To tell the story of William Tocco without acknowledging this vast, invisible cemetery of victims is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of his achievement. He was not a benign businessman who happened to operate outside the law. He was the CEO of an enterprise whose primary product was fear and whose business model relied on the systematic exploitation and destruction of human dignity. The empire he built may have been quiet, but the pain it inflicted echoed for a lifetime in the hearts of those it touched, a somber and permanent countermelody to the story of his power. The intricate and shadow-veiled empire that William Tocco so meticulously architected did not exist in a vacuum. It was a complex organism that required not just a leader of strategic genius but an entire ecosystem of support, a network of lieutenants, soldiers, and associates who formed the sinew and muscle of the organization, each man a critical component in the machine. And to understand the full scope of Tocco's dominion, one must shine a light on these key figures who operated in his orbit, men whose lives and actions were inextricably linked to the rise and consolidation of the Detroit partnership. Foremost among them was, of course, Tocco-Zerilli, the co-architect of the empire and Tocco's lifelong partner in power. Theirs was perhaps the most successful and stable partnership in the history of the American Mafia, a brotherhood forged in the old country and tempered in the violent fires of Prohibition-era Detroit. Where Tocco was the cerebral strategist, the quiet planner who preferred to remain in the background, Zerilli was often the operational heart, a man deeply involved in the day-to-day management of the family's affairs. He was a figure of immense respect and authority in his own right, and his unwavering loyalty to Tocco was the bedrock upon which the entire organization's stability was built. This was not a subordinate relationship but a true partnership of equals, a duumvirate that presented a united, unbreakable front to both their enemies and their subordinates, preventing the internal power struggles that crippled so many other crime families. Another pivotal figure was Anthony Giacalone, a man who embodied the more brutal and intimidating aspect of the organization's power. Known as Tony Jack, Giacalone was a feared enforcer and a prolific earner, deeply involved in the family's loan sharking and labor racketeering operations. He cultivated an image of menacing flamboyance, with expensive suits and a reputation for ruthless violence, which stood in some contrast to the low-key style of Tocco and Zerilli, yet he remained a loyal and effective captain within their structure. Giacalone's name would become nationally infamous due to his suspected involvement in the disappearance of Teamsters union leader Jimmy Hoffa. He was one of the last men Hoffa was seen with before he vanished in 1975. This connection to one of America's most enduring mysteries highlighted the Detroit family's deep ties to organized labor and its reach into the highest levels of national corruption. Then there were the financial wizards, the men who mastered the art of moving and hiding the organization's immense wealth. Figures like Michael Big Mike Polizzi worked diligently to launder the profits from illegal ventures through a web of legitimate businesses, including bars, restaurants, and the jukebox and vending machine industry. These men were the accountants of the underworld, essential for transforming dirty cash into clean, investable capital and for creating the veneer of legitimate entrepreneurship that protected the top echelon from direct prosecution for so long. Beyond the inner circle were the street-level soldiers and crew bosses, men like Peter Horst Lecavalier and John Papa John Prizziola, who managed specific territories and criminal operations, ensuring the street taxes were collected, the gambling dens ran smoothly, and the orders from the top were executed with precision. These were the men on the front lines, the interface between the hidden executive suite and the gritty reality of the street, and their loyalty and efficiency were critical to the organization's daily function. This diverse cabinet of talent, the strategist, the operator, the enforcer, the financier, and the street captain, illustrates the corporate-like structure Tocco had implemented. He was a master of delegation and talent management, understanding that no single man, no matter how brilliant, could micromanage an empire of such scale and complexity. He placed the right men in the right positions, granted them a degree of autonomy within their spheres, and held them accountable for results. This structure created a resilient and adaptable organization, one that could withstand the loss of individual members, even its leader, because the system itself was designed to endure. The relationships between these men were governed by a complex code of loyalty, respect, and fear. Their bonds were strengthened by shared experiences, cultural ties, and the immense profits they generated together, but they were also tempered by the ever-present knowledge of the consequences of disloyalty. This network of key figures, operating under Tocco's overarching philosophy, was the true engine of the Detroit partnership. They were the instruments through which his will was made manifest, the channels through which his influence flowed into every corner of the city's underworld and beyond. To tell the story of William Tocco is to also tell the story of Zerilli's steadfastness, Giacaloni's intimidating prowess, and the quiet efficiency of the financial minds who hid their fortune. They were the pillars that supported his throne, and their collective actions, under his strategic direction, wrote one of the most successful and enduring chapters in the dark history of American organized crime. The sprawling and complex saga of William Tocco's criminal empire, while a masterclass in organizational structure and strategic foresight, inevitably invites a profound and critical examination of the law enforcement and judicial institutions that stood as the nominal opposition to his decades-long reign, a conflict that evolved from a disjointed and often corrupt local struggle into a sophisticated, technologically advanced, and federally-led war of attrition that would ultimately prove to be the most significant threat to the enduring legacy he had worked so tirelessly to build. In the early years, during the roaring chaos of Prohibition and the subsequent consolidation of power, local law enforcement in Detroit was, for the most part, outgunned, outmaneuvered, and deeply compromised. The Detroit Police Department, operating in a city exploding with population and criminal opportunity, was simply not equipped to confront a highly disciplined, well-funded, and strategically savvy organization like the partnership. More importantly, the systemic corruption that Tocco and his associates engineered acted as a powerful immunosuppressant on the body of justice. Patrol officers, detectives, and even high-ranking officials were routinely placed on the pad, the regular payroll of the mob, ensuring that raids would be telegraphed, that evidence would go missing, and that investigations into sensitive matters would be quietly shelved. This created an environment where the partnership could operate with a brazenness that belied their low-profile philosophy, secure in the knowledge that the very institution designed to stop them had been neutered from within. This local impotence was compounded by a critical failure at the federal level for many years, namely the stubborn refusal of J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to even acknowledge the existence of a national organized crime syndicate. Hoover's public stance, driven by a combination of personal vanity, political calculation, and a focus on bank robbers and flashy desperados, created a massive intelligence and operational vacuum that allowed families like Detroit's to flourish unchecked. For Tocco, this federal blind spot was a gift of incalculable value, providing a protective umbrella under which his corporate empire could mature and diversify without fear of a coordinated national investigation. The first real crack in this defensive wall came not from traditional policing, but from the financial front, with the intelligence gathered by the Kefauver Committee in the early 1950s and the relentless pursuit of the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS, armed with the legal precedent that had toppled Al Capone, began the painstaking, unglamorous work of forensic accounting, scrutinizing Tocco's lifestyle, his business holdings, and his financial transactions, searching for the discrepancies between his visible means of support and his observable wealth. This was a new kind of warfare, one fought with ledgers and audit trails instead of bullets and wiretaps, and it was a battle for which the old-world gangster was profoundly unprepared. The conviction and imprisonment of Tocco on tax-related charges in 1960 was a watershed moment, a demonstration that the federal government had finally found a key to the fortress. The 1970s marked the true turning point, the beginning of the end for the kind of empire Tocco had built. The establishment of the Witness Protection Program and the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, represented a revolutionary shift in the legal landscape. RICO was a sledgehammer designed to smash criminal organizations, not just individual members. It allowed prosecutors to connect the dots between the boss in his mansion and the street-level crimes committed by his soldiers, painting the entire enterprise as a single, continuing criminal conspiracy. For the Detroit family, which prided itself on its corporate structure, RICO was an existential threat, as it targeted that very structure itself. Simultaneously, the Witness Protection Program offered a path out for disaffected members, systematically dismantling the code of omerta that had been the organization's cultural shield. The fear of prison now had to be weighed against the fear of a mob-sanctioned death, and for some, the calculus began to shift. The FBI, under new directives, began to employ sophisticated electronic surveillance, planting bugs in social clubs and cars, capturing the whispered conversations and coded language that had once been secure. These tapes provided juries with an unprecedented, inside look at the mundane and brutal realities of mob life, making the abstract concept of a criminal organization tangible and undeniable. The subsequent decades saw a relentless, multi-pronged federal assault on the Detroit partnership, culminating in the series of high-profile RICO trials in the 1990s that decapitated its leadership, including the conviction of William's nephew, Jack Tocco. This long, slow-burning conflict between Tocco's shadow government and the forces of law and order is a central theme of his story. It was a battle fought across multiple fronts, on the streets through intimidation and violence, in the halls of power through corruption and influence, in the courtroom through legal maneuvering, and in the realm of finance through forensic investigation. In the end, the immense resources and persistent, evolving tactics of the federal government proved to be an opponent that even Tocco's brilliantly designed machine could not completely withstand. His story, therefore, is not just one of criminal triumph, but also a record of its gradual, institutional containment, a testament to the fact that in a prolonged contest between a democratic state and a criminal syndicate, the state, once fully mobilized, holds ultimately decisive advantages in resources, technology, and legal authority. The empire of William Tocco was ultimately brought to heel not by a single heroic figure, but by the slow, grinding, and impersonal wheels of American jurisprudence, a process that demonstrated that no shadow, no matter how deep or well-constructed, can forever escape the illumination of a determined and patient justice. As we approach the final contemplation of William Tocco's immense and shadow-draped narrative, it becomes essential to step back from the intricate details of his criminal enterprises and personal relationships to examine the broader cultural and mythological space he occupies. The way his story has been processed, remembered, and ultimately transformed into a specific kind of American legend, one that differs profoundly from the more popularized and romanticized gangster archetypes that dominate the public imagination. Unlike the flamboyant and tragic figure of Al Capone, whose life seems tailor-made for cinematic drama, or the charismatic and defiant John Gotti, who courted the media spotlight with a star's vanity, Tocco exists in the cultural memory as a specter, a ghost in the machine. His presence felt more through the enduring system he built than through any vivid personal anecdotes or sensational public moments. This very absence of a flamboyant persona is, in fact, the core of his mythological power. He has become the godfather of the quiet godfathers, the patron saint of those who understand that true authority whispers. In the vast library of mafia literature and film, the Detroit partnership under Tocco is often a footnote, mentioned with respect but rarely explored in depth, because its history lacks the Shakespearean betrayals and operatic bloodshed that make for compelling narrative. There is no equivalent of the Castellammarere-Reese War, no public execution on the steps of a New York hotel, no dramatic courtroom outburst. Instead, there is only the quiet, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient accumulation of power, a story that is far more difficult to dramatize but, in many ways, far more instructive about the real nature of institutional corruption. This has created a peculiar duality in Tocco's legacy. Within the underworld and among law enforcement and historians, he is revered as a master strategist, a genius of criminal corporate governance, while in the popular culture, he remains an obscure figure, known only to aficionados of organized crime history. This obscurity is, of course, the ultimate validation of his life's philosophy. He achieved the remarkable feat of becoming one of the most powerful crime lords in American history while remaining virtually invisible to the society he so profoundly influenced. His mythology is not one of celebrity, but of efficacy, not of notoriety, but of results. He is the antigote, and in a world saturated with loud, performative figures, the legend of the quiet man who wielded ultimate power from the shadows holds a unique and growing fascination. It speaks to a sophisticated understanding of how the world truly works, acknowledging that the levers of real power are rarely visible on the public stage. Furthermore, his story has become a foundational part of Detroit's own complex and gritty self-mythology. In a city defined by industry, resilience, and a certain blue-collar ruthlessness, Tocco embodies a dark parallel to the narrative of the industrial titans. Just as Henry Ford revolutionized production and shaped the modern world, William Tocco revolutionized criminal enterprise and shaped the city's underworld. Both were visionaries who built empires, both understood systems and efficiency, and both left an indelible, if starkly different, mark on the city and the nation. This uncomfortable parallel forces Detroit to confront the full spectrum of its history, to acknowledge that its growth was fueled not only by genius and innovation but also by predation and corruption. The legend of Tocco is a permanent part of the city's identity, a ghost in the sprawling, abandoned factories and the revitalized downtown, a reminder of a time when the city's power dynamics were even more starkly drawn than they are today. For contemporary audiences, the enduring relevance of Tocco's story lies in its chilling lessons about the vulnerabilities of our institutions and the nature of power in a complex society. In an age of increasing corporate influence, shadowy political action committees, and the often impenetrable mechanics of global finance, the Tocco model feels less like a relic of the past and more like a disturbing precursor to the present. He demonstrated how a determined group could infiltrate and co-opt the very structures meant to regulate society, turning them into instruments of their own will. His life is a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy in the face of patient, well-funded, and morally unconstrained adversaries. The legend of William Black Bill Tocco, therefore, continues to grow not because we celebrate his actions, but because we fear their implications. He is a dark mirror held up to our systems of power, and the reflection we see is one of disquieting efficiency and enduring influence, a reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we never see coming, the quiet men in the shadows who are patiently, relentlessly, building their empires. The monumental and intricately woven narrative of William Tocco's life and criminal dominion, spanning the vast and transformative expanse of the 20th century, ultimately draws towards its final, contemplative closure, a moment to synthesize the myriad threads of ambition, power, strategy, and legacy into a cohesive understanding of the man and the shadow he cast across a city and an era. His story is not one with a simple moral or a clean, dramatic conclusion, but rather a complex and sobering chronicle of a particular kind of American existence, a life lived in the profound and deliberate chasm between public perception and private reality, between respectable citizenship and ruthless criminality. From the young Sicilian immigrant stepping onto the bustling shores of a promised land, to the aging, ailing patriarch reflecting on an empire built from the ground up, his journey traces the arc of a dark alternative to the classic immigrant success story, a path where the rules of society were not obstacles to overcome through hard work, but mere suggestions to be circumvented through smarter, more brutal, and more patient methods. The core of his astonishing success lay in a psychological and strategic triad of virtues that, in any legitimate field, would have marked him as a visionary leader. An almost supernatural capacity for patience, allowing him to play a long game that stretched across decades where others sought quick, flashy scores. A profound understanding of organizational structure, enabling him to build a corporate entity that could survive his own imprisonment and eventual death, and a deep, instinctual commitment to secrecy, making his power felt rather than seen, a pervasive force whose source remained frustratingly elusive to his enemies. This trinity of attributes allowed him to navigate the seismic shifts of his time, the boom of Prohibition, the turmoil of the Great Depression, the industrial frenzy of World War II, and the creeping scrutiny of the federal government, not merely as a survivor, but as a constant and growing force, a fixed point in the chaotic evolution of the American underworld. His legacy, therefore, is multifaceted and deeply ambiguous. On one hand, he stands as a testament to the terrifying potential of human ambition when it is utterly divorced from ethical constraints, a cautionary tale written in the blood, fear, and corrupted institutions he left in his wake. The human cost of his empire is incalculable, a vast tapestry of silent suffering woven from the lives of extorted shopkeepers, broken debtors, corrupted officials, and murdered rivals. This is the indelible stain on his legacy, the undeniable truth that his success was predicated on the systematic infliction of misery and the subversion of justice. Yet, on the other hand, he cannot be dismissed as a simple thug or a mere purveyor of violence. He was a criminal CEO, a strategic genius whose understanding of economics, political science, and human psychology would be the envy of any legitimate business school. He built something that endured, an organization that outlived him and adapted to changing times, and in doing so, he forced a re-evaluation of what organized crime truly is. Not a collection of street thugs, but a sophisticated, alternative form of governance, a shadow state that operates with its own laws, its own economy, and its own brutal form of justice. The city of Detroit, the stage for his entire life's work, bears the ghost of his influence to this day, not in the overt ways of his era, but in the cultural memory, the patterns of power, and the lingering understanding of how easily a great city can be steered from the shadows. The long, slow battle to dismantle his empire, waged by dedicated agents of the law, stands as a proud, if protracted, victory for the forces of order, proving that even the most brilliantly constructed criminal enterprise is ultimately vulnerable to the persistent, methodical pressure of a democratic society. In the final analysis, William Black Bill Tocco emerges from the mists of history not as a hero or a monster, but as a profoundly significant and unsettling figure, a man who holds a dark mirror up to the American soul. He reflects our deepest drives for success, security, and legacy, and he demonstrates, with chilling clarity, the potential consequences when those drives are pursued without conscience or compromise. His story is complete, his empire faded, his name now a subject for historical inquiry rather than a command to be feared. But the questions his life poses about power, corruption, and the nature of success remain as urgent and unresolved as ever. He is a permanent part of the American story, a dark strand in the national DNA, a reminder that the pursuit of power, in all its forms, is one of the most complex and consequential narratives a human life can tell. As the final echoes of William Tocco's personal story fade into history, the narrative must inevitably expand to encompass the fate of the institution he left behind, the Detroit Partnership, tracing its trajectory through the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st. A journey that serves as the ultimate testament to both the resilience of his original design and the inevitable forces of entropy and societal change that ultimately constrain even the most formidable of criminal empires. The passing of the torch from the founding generation, first to Tocco-Zerilli and then to William's nephew, Jack Tocco, was managed with the same seamless efficiency that had characterized the organization's business operations, a clear indication that Tocco's corporate model had successfully institutionalized succession planning, avoiding the bloody power vacuums that crippled other families. Under Jack Tocco's leadership, which spanned from the late 1970s into the 1990s, the family continued to adhere to the core Tocco doctrine of low-profile, profit-driven criminality, but it was a reign conducted under a perpetual state of federal siege. The golden age of untouchable power was over, replaced by a grinding war of attrition against the RICO statute and an FBI armed with electronic surveillance and a growing stable of cooperating witnesses. Jack Tocco himself, a man who had learned the business at the knee of his uncle and Zerilli, was a reflection of the new era, even more cautious, even more secretive, and constantly maneuvering to preserve the remnants of the empire in the face of relentless pressure. His 1996 conviction on racketeering charges was a symbolic full-circle moment, a direct parallel to his uncle's conviction decades earlier. But this time the legal blow was even more crushing, a product of the more powerful RICO tools, and it effectively decapitated the family's traditional leadership structure for years to come. The new millennium found the Detroit crime family a shadow of its former self, yet, remarkably, not extinct. Law enforcement officials and crime experts consistently report that the organization, while vastly reduced in power and scope, continues to exist, a phantom limb of the city's underworld. Its operations are believed to have shifted significantly, moving away from the high-profile, street-level rackets that defined its past and deeper into the realms of white-collar crime, cyber fraud, and illegal gambling operations that are harder to detect and prosecute. They are said to maintain a presence in certain labor unions, though their influence is a pale imitation of the stranglehold they once held over the Teamsters. Their membership has aged and dwindled, with the old-world Sicilian traditions proving less appealing to subsequent generations of Italian Americans who have access to legitimate avenues of success that were unavailable to their ancestors. The city itself has transformed around them, the densely packed ethnic neighborhoods that provided their recruits and cultural camouflage have dispersed, and the economic landscape has shifted from industrial manufacturing to a more diffuse service and technology-based economy, creating fewer obvious points of vulnerability for the old-school rackets of labor extortion and protection. The digital age has also presented both a challenge and an opportunity. While it has made communication and financial transactions more traceable for law enforcement, it has also opened up new frontiers for crime in cyberspace, areas where the traditional, face-to-face methods of the mafia are less effective. The enduring, albeit diminished, existence of the Detroit family into the 21st century is the most powerful part of William Tocco's legacy. It proves that he did not just build a criminal gang, he built an institution, a resilient system capable of adapting, surviving, and persisting long after its founder and his immediate successors were gone. The organization has been forced to contract, to become more niche, to operate in the cracks and margins of a society that has largely moved on, but it has not disappeared. This longevity is a silent tribute to the foundational strength of the structure Tocco put in place. The discipline, the secrecy, the corporate hierarchy, and the patient, long-term view. While it will never again wield the city-shaping power it held in the days of Black Bill, its continued, quiet presence is a haunting reminder that the forces he represented, the corruption of power, the allure of illicit profit, and the resilience of organized criminality, are never fully vanquished, only contained and managed. The story of the Detroit partnership in the modern era is thus the final, slow-burning chapter of William Tocco's life's work, a demonstration that the most carefully laid foundations can withstand the storms of time and law enforcement, even if the grand edifice they were meant to support can never be fully rebuilt. The empire is a ghost, but it is a ghost that still walks, a permanent and unsettling part of the city's subconscious, a living legacy to the quiet man who understood that true power is not about ruling in the moment, but about building something that endures. To fully appreciate the depth and complexity of William Tocco's criminal empire, one must venture beyond the traditional narratives of violence and racketeering and delve into the sophisticated financial architecture that underpinned his entire operation, a hidden economy that was as meticulously managed as any Fortune 500 company and which served as the true lifeblood of the Detroit partnership's longevity and power. The immense rivers of cash generated by bootlegging, gambling, and loan sharking presented a monumental problem. How to transform this volatile, illicit wealth into stable, legitimate-looking capital that could be invested, spent, and passed on to future generations without attracting the fatal attention of the Internal Revenue Service or other law enforcement agencies. Tocco's solution was to pioneer a system of money laundering that was remarkably advanced for its time, creating a complex web of legitimate businesses that acted as financial sponges, soaking up dirty money and wringing it out as clean, taxable income. These front businesses were carefully chosen for their high cash volume, which made it easy to commingle illegal profits with legitimate revenue without raising obvious red flags. Laundromats, bars, restaurants, and vending machine companies became the cornerstones of this financial shell game. A bar owned by the partnership, for instance, could dramatically inflate its daily receipts, claiming to have sold thousands more drinks than it actually had, thus providing a plausible explanation for the constant influx of cash from its gambling operations. This process, repeated across a diverse portfolio of businesses, created a powerful illusion of legitimate entrepreneurship, allowing Tocco and his top lieutenants to present themselves as successful businessmen, complete with tax returns that, while not entirely truthful, were just plausible enough to withstand casual scrutiny. Beyond these classic cash businesses, the organization also invested heavily in real estate, a timeless method of parking and growing wealth while creating a veneer of solid respectability. They purchased apartment buildings, commercial properties, and parcels of land, often through layers of shell corporations and trusted intermediaries to obscure the true ownership. These holdings not only appreciated in value over time, providing a stable store of wealth, but they also generated rental income that could be reported on tax forms, further legitimizing their fortune. The family's forays into the legitimate economy extended even further, with investments in the jukebox and music distribution industry, the food service industry, and later, through their national connections, into the nascent casino industry in Las Vegas and Havana. This diversification was a critical strategic move. It not only laundered money but also insulated the organization from the downfall of any single criminal racket. If gambling was cracked down on, the real estate holdings remained. If the unions were cleaned up, the bars and restaurants continued to generate cash. This created a resilient financial ecosystem that could withstand external shocks. The management of this vast financial network required its own specialized cadre within the organization. Accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors who either were corrupt themselves or were willfully blind to the source of the funds they were managing. These were the quiet, anonymous technicians of the empire, men who never threw a punch or collected a street tax, but whose expertise was every bit as vital to the partnership's survival as any enforcer's brutality. They understood the nuances of corporate law, tax codes, and international finance, and they used this knowledge to construct an impenetrable labyrinth of financial transactions designed to confuse and deter any investigator. The sheer scale of this operation was staggering. By some estimates, at the peak of its power, the Detroit Partnership was one of the largest and most profitable financial entities in the city, legitimate or otherwise. This focus on financial sophistication highlights a crucial and often overlooked aspect of Tocco's genius. He understood that in the modern world, financial control was ultimately more important than physical control. It was better to own the bank that financed a business than to simply extort the business owner. It was more powerful to control a union's multi-million-dollar pension fund than to simply shake down its members. By building this robust financial infrastructure, Tocco ensured that his power was not just a matter of fear, but was embedded in the very economic fabric of Detroit. The money was cleaned, invested, and then its influence was leveraged to corrupt politicians, influence unions, and fund further expansion. This self-perpetuating cycle of illicit profit, laundering, and reinvestment was the engine that drove the empire for decades. It allowed Tocco to project an image of a respectable, wealthy citizen while his organization systematically looted the city from the shadows. The relentless focus of federal law enforcement on this financial web, using tools like tax evasion charges and asset forfeiture laws, was a testament to its critical importance. They knew that to truly destroy the monster, they had to follow the money and cut off its head. The sophisticated financial empire that William Tocco built remains one of his most enduring and impactful legacies, a dark mirror to the legitimate economy and a chilling demonstration of how easily the tools of capitalism can be perverted to serve a criminal enterprise, creating a legacy of wealth and influence that would long outlive the man himself. The immense and sprawling narrative of William Tocco's life and criminal empire, while a story of one man's unprecedented rise to power, is also fundamentally a story about a city, a profound and symbiotic relationship between a criminal mastermind and the urban landscape he helped to shape. A dynamic that reveals how the very strengths and vulnerabilities of Detroit as an industrial titan became the essential nutrients that allowed his shadow empire to not only take root but to thrive for generations. Detroit in the early 20th century was a city of explosive, almost chaotic, growth, a magnet for hundreds of thousands of seekers drawn by the promise of high wages in the roaring automotive plants, a place where the future was being forged on assembly lines at a dizzying pace. This rapid, largely unregulated expansion created a perfect ecosystem for organized crime to flourish. The city's institutions, its police force, its political machine, its social services, were stretched thin, struggling to keep pace with the sheer velocity of change, leaving vast areas of civic life ripe for exploitation by anyone with the capital, the cunning, and the ruthlessness to fill the void. William Tocco was that man, and he looked upon the bustling, smoke-choked city not just as a territory to be conquered, but as a complex machine to be understood, reverse-engineered, and ultimately, controlled. He saw that the city's greatest strength, its centralized, powerful industrial economy, was also its greatest weakness. The auto industry's reliance on just-in-time production and intricate supply chains made it exquisitely vulnerable to disruption, a vulnerability he exploited with surgical precision through his control of key labor unions. A single, well-placed threat of a work stoppage at a critical parts supplier or on a vital trucking route could bring a multi-million-dollar assembly line to a grinding halt, giving him immense leverage over some of the most powerful industrialists in the world. This was not simple street-level extortion. It was corporate-scale blackmail, a form of systemic parasitism that fed on the very heart of the city's economic engine. The city's unique geography, particularly the narrow, bustling Detroit River, provided another critical advantage, transforming a natural border into a superhighway for contraband during Prohibition and creating the initial capital infusion that bankrolled the entire enterprise. But beyond these tangible factors, it was the city's social and demographic composition that provided the most durable foundation for Tocco's power. The massive influx of immigrants, including a large and tightly knit Sicilian community, created dense ethnic enclaves where the old-world code of omerta could be preserved and where distrust of external authority was a deeply ingrained cultural value. Within these neighborhoods, Tocco was not an alien predator. He was a local boy made good, a man of respect who provided jobs, settled disputes, and offered protection, weaving a narrative of benevolent leadership that masked the brutal reality of his operations. This community support acted as a formidable defensive barrier, a wall of silence that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to penetrate his inner circle or gather intelligence. The city's political culture, famously permeable and pragmatic, was another key ingredient. Corruption was not an aberration in early to mid-century Detroit. It was often seen as a cost of doing business, a way to grease the wheels of a cumbersome bureaucracy. Tocco and his associates became master mechanics of this corrupt machine, strategically placing bribes, offering favors, and building alliances with politicians, police officials, and union leaders, effectively creating a parallel government that operated with its own laws and its own brutal form of justice. This deep entanglement with the city's power structure meant that the partnership's influence was not a foreign growth on the body politic, but a cancer that had metastasized within its vital organs. The story of William Tocco is therefore inseparable from the story of Detroit itself. His rise paralleled the city's ascent to industrial preeminence. His consolidation of power mirrored the city's maturation into a global manufacturing capital, and the gradual containment of his empire coincided with the city's own painful deindustrialization and decline. He was a product of Detroit's unique energy, its raw ambition, and its often ruthless pragmatism. He understood the city's rhythms, its pressures, and its secret levers of power better than any mayor or corporate CEO, and he used that understanding to build a kingdom in the shadows, a dark reflection of the city of industry that operated in plain sight. To examine the history of 20th century Detroit is to inevitably encounter the ghost of William Tocco, a reminder that the city's glittering achievements were always accompanied by a shadow, a testament to the fact that the same forces of ambition, innovation, and relentless drive that built a modern metropolis could also, when channeled through a different moral compass, build something equally formidable in the darkness. His legacy is a permanent part of the city's DNA, a hidden thread in the tapestry of its history, a chilling lesson in how a city's greatest strengths can be perverted into its most profound vulnerabilities. The narrative of William Tocco's life, while firmly rooted in the specific soil of Detroit and the particular history of the American Mafia, ultimately transcends its time and place to pose a series of profound and universal questions about the nature of power, the architecture of legacy, and the complex moral calculus of human ambition, forcing us to look beyond the specifics of his criminal enterprises to the deeper philosophical implications of his existence. His story is a stark and challenging parable about the fundamental nature of influence, demonstrating with chilling clarity that power is not necessarily, or even primarily, about the loud command or the public display of force, but about the silent, patient, and strategic accumulation of leverage over the systems that govern human life. Tocco understood that true, enduring power was systemic. It was the ability to control the flow of money, to dictate the terms of labor, to corrupt the instruments of justice, and to weave one's will so deeply into the economic and social fabric that it became indistinguishable from the natural order of things. He was a master of what political scientists would call structural power, the power to shape the very rules of the game itself, rather than just being a dominant player within it. This is why his empire proved so resilient. It was not an army occupying a city, but a virus that had rewritten the host's DNA, making the body itself an accomplice to its own subjugation. This understanding forces a re-evaluation of what we consider strength and weakness in a leader. The flamboyant gangster, the charismatic demagogue, the publicly feared tyrant. These figures, for all their immediate impact, often contain the seeds of their own destruction within their visibility. Tocco, by contrast, embodied a different kind of strength, one founded on restraint, on silence, on a profound and almost inhuman patience. His was the strength of the deep ocean current, which moves with irresistible force without ever disturbing the surface, rather than the strength of the crashing wave, which is dramatic but fleeting. This model of leadership, while applied to a criminal enterprise, carries disturbing echoes in the legitimate worlds of politics and business, where the most powerful figures are often those who operate away from the cameras, in the closed-door meetings and the labyrinthine corridors of corporate and governmental influence. Tocco's life thus becomes a dark mirror, reflecting the hidden mechanics of power that operate in our own world, forcing us to question who truly holds the reins and whether the faces we see in public are the ones truly directing the play. Furthermore, his story presents a profound challenge to our conventional narratives of success and the American dream. He achieved, by any material or influential measure, a level of success that is the stuff of legend, rising from penniless immigrant to the undisputed master of a vast, wealth-generating empire. He provided security and prosperity for his family, commanded the respect and fear of his peers, and built an organization that endured for generations. Yet, he accomplished all of this through a career of predation, violence, and systemic corruption. This creates a deep moral dissonance, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the drive for success and the moral compass that is meant to guide it are not inherently linked. Tocco's life suggests that ambition, intelligence, and strategic brilliance are morally neutral tools, and that their ultimate value is determined entirely by the ends to which they are applied. He is the ultimate counterargument to the idea that virtue is a prerequisite for, or a natural byproduct of, monumental achievement. His legacy, therefore, is not just a criminal record. It is a philosophical provocation. It asks us whether a legacy built on sand can, through sheer force of will and engineering, be made to endure as long as one built on stone. It challenges our desire for moral simplicity in history, presenting us with a figure who was, by all accounts, a devoted family man and a monster, a community benefactor and a parasite, a visionary and a destroyer. There is no easy resolution to these contradictions, no simple way to categorize William Tocco. He exists in the ambiguous space between these extremes, a permanent reminder of the complexity of the human soul and the terrifying potential of a will that is utterly unconstrained by conscience. To study his life is to be denied the comfort of easy judgment and to be forced instead into a deeper, more unsettling contemplation of the dark allure of power and the true, often hidden, cost of the legacies we build.